Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. And you know I'm your humble host. Y'all mean a revolution, and we got a World War III alert. But first, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe. Let everybody know Core Figures live. The Zionists, the small hats, have lost their mind. They absolutely is taking advantage of the world being distracted by the assassination of the attempted assassination of Trump and this P. Diddy stuff, and they have set the Middle East on fire. We could soon be drugged into World War III.
On Hezbollah, if I'm still allowed to use that word. The Lebanese resistance, no doubt, were amongst those who use mobile phones. But it was an attack on everybody in Lebanon with a mobile phone, with a pager, with a car radio, with a solar panel, which is more or less everybody who can afford to do so. And it was an attack on anybody in the vicinity of anybody in possession of any and all of those things. If you were a passenger in a taxi with a terrorist-infiltrated car radio, you are this evening a victim. At least 24 people have been killed, several of them children. 200 people are critically wounded, and thousands of people have been injured. 5, 10, 15,000 explosions have taken place. Anybody in a hospital where the nurses routinely use pagers to communicate with each other is a victim this evening of Israel's terrorist attack. It could be your mother, you know, who was in a ward where the nurse was passing by talking to another nurse on the pager when it exploded in her face and in the face of your mother. If you live next door to somebody with a solar panel on their roof, you too are this evening a victim. If you are amongst those stood in shops, in hospitals, on taxi queues, in schools and universities, you too are a victim this evening. The play was fiendishly clever, though it can be repeated by others. Motorola, which has launched a $1 billion lawsuit against the state of Israel, is now finished. Motorola will never work again. No one with the remotest sense would ever buy a Motorola product ever again. And yet they, it seems, are entirely innocent of this crime. A company in Hungary, a shell company in Hungary, bought the license to construct and distribute Motorola products. They paid by BACS transfer through a bank in the Middle East, the country as yet unspecified. If it is Israel, of course, it's QED. But if it is another country with relations with Israel, that will be a very serious development indeed. The shell company in Hungary then assembled thousands of electronic products from car radios to pagers and mobile phones and placed 20 grams of explosive material in thousands upon thousands of them. Then they sold them in Lebanon. The havoc is widespread. The war will be more widespread still. In parenthesis, there was only one hospital in Lebanon not using the 2024 Motorola devices. Only one. That was the American University of Beirut Hospital, all of whose pagers were replaced by new ones just last week. Make of that what you will. Make of the American overflight of Lebanon in the day before the attack, this mass terrorist outrage was launched. Make of that what you will. However they were triggered, it's clear that the batch of thousands of devices, from mobile phones to solar panels, were sold from Hungary. Motorola will launch a $1 billion lawsuit against Israel. Good luck getting paid for that. The company will, of course, go into liquidation. But the import for the electronics business in general across the world cannot be underestimated. The truth is, no electronic device originating in any Western country can now be trusted. It might not yet be a thing in Britain or even in the United States, although it could be, because what Israel has done with these devices can be done by anybody, will be done by somebody. Al-Qaeda could do it. They could set up a shell company in Hungary and sell exploding electronic devices into your country. The man in the electronic shop in your high street could do it. Think about it. Open all the electronic devices, put 20 grams of explosives inside them, close them up again and sell them to you. He might be an Al-Qaeda sympathizer, mightn't he? Nobody will ever, with safety, buy a Western origin electronic device ever again, which might be why they've worked so hard to close down Huawei. You'll recall that the lack of an intelligence backdoor into the Huawei products was the real reason why they banned and restricted Huawei all over the Western world. Well, now we know a possible reason why. But there are other implications too. Was the president of Iran, President Raisi, whose helicopter crash killed him and the Iranian foreign minister just a couple of months ago, did he have a pager on board? Did he have a mobile phone on board? Did the helicopter have a Motorola radio on board? And if Israel can do this and is ready to do this to Lebanon over the last 24 hours, where else have they done it? Who really blew up the port of Beirut with devastating effect and mass casualties a couple of years ago? And if Israel could do this,
Absolute, fella.
and if Israel could do the port, could Israel have done the Twin Towers on 9/11/2001? Of course, we know that they could. The question of whether they would has been answered today. Any country which is ready to explode devices anywhere, everywhere, no matter who is carrying them, whose house they're in, where they are when they explode, is guilty of mass terrorism. In one sense, it is the biggest act of mass terrorism since 9/11. If you look at the quantum of the number of explosions, the number of injured people, and the climbing number of dead people, it's hard for me to recollect a more serious, egregious act of international terror than has been committed today by Israel. But here is the rub. Israel can only do it because of your government. Israel can only do any and all of these things. Like the 8 children they murdered in a Gaza school again today, another school massacre in Gaza today. They can only do it because of your government. Now you may say, you may shrug, that's my government, it's not me. But the people in Lebanon on the last 24 hours could say exactly the same. You were targeting Hezbollah, you say, but you killed me. You killed my child. Therefore, why should I not kill you? Why should I not maim your child? Your government is committing crimes against us. Why shouldn't we commit crimes against you? Do you see where I'm going here? This whole affair is pregnant with mass slaughter, indiscriminate slaughter, impossible to target, immeasurable, unlimited in time. It is an act using weapons of mass destruction. WMD, paid for ultimately by you, because your government is not using its own money. Our government doesn't use any of its own money for anything, even their wives' underwear, as we were discussing extensively, intensively on Wednesday night. They're using your money. So the crimes that Israel has committed is being paid for not by your government, but by you. And you are allowing your government to do it. In fact, you're electing politicians who make no secret of the fact that they are going to continue to do it. Do you see where I'm going here? Anyway, the next blow will be struck presumably in the next 24, 48 hours when all-out war breaks out between Israel and Lebanon. Everyone said they wanted to avoid a wider war, but they didn't want to avoid it enough. Not enough to order Israel, its client, to cease and desist. No, not that much. They say that they did not want to draw in the other countries in a wider regional war, but they didn't want that enough either, because Iran has not yet spoken, to some people's bemusement, puzzlement, but it has to speak now, because most of the people in Lebanon, in fact, vastly the most people in Lebanon, are their co-religionists. The vast majority of the population of Lebanon are Shiites. That's why I always laughed in Parliament when they talked about the need to support democracy in Lebanon. If there was democracy in Lebanon, Hassan Nasrallah would have been the president for the last 20 years and for the next 20 years. The great majority of the population of Lebanon are Iran's co-religionists. And Iran has just watched them having holes blown in them. And again, their children murdered, and will have to now act. And so the much vaunted pause in Iran's retaliation must surely now come to an end. The Lebanese resistance themselves are highly capable of launching devastating counterattack on the state of Israel, all of which presages one thing: an Israeli invasion of Lebanon must be imminent. Indeed, this chaos and bloodshed that they have sown must be a harbinger of an all-out Israeli invasion of Lebanon. An all-out Israeli invasion of Lebanon will be a very bloody affair. Lebanon gave them a bloody good hiding, not once, but twice. Drove them out in the year 2000, drove them out again in the year 2006. The Lebanese resistance and a united Lebanese population, even the far-right parties in Lebanon, are now on side with the need for Lebanon's right to defend itself. Remember that right. And it will be exercised. And so all-out war in the Middle East is now imminent. That should concern you. After all, the Middle East contains the Suez Canal, it contains the Red Sea, it contains a gigantic portion of the world's oil and gas reserves, and of course the Straits of Hormuz are the straits through which vast quantities of goods upon which we depend daily flow and pass. But it ought to concern you for another reason. Your soldiers are there. Your soldiers, your sailors, your warship, your warplanes, your intelligence men, your special services, your undercover spies are all there. Tonight in Lebanon, United Nations vehicles are being attacked by the angry populace who are seeking to set fire to United Nations vehicles, because those, so far, are the only vehicles they can identify readily as being the property of the so-called international community. But it will not be long before other facilities, other personnel are identified as coming from the axis of evil, headed by the United States of America as the head of the dog, the tail of the dog being the United Kingdom of Great Britain and, for now, Northern Ireland, with the other Western countries, allies, NATO members barking like little dogs running behind them. That's why it should concern you. And it should concern you because you have a government that will not listen to the voices of their own citizenry, will not allow their own citizenry to speak freely in the way that I'm doing now about what has happened and what is about to happen, will not allow their population a meaningful choice in so-called democratic elections, is arresting journalists and truth speakers at airports all over the Western, but in particular in the United States and in the United Kingdom. We are in the front line. And it should concern you that that's not the only front line we are on. The front line of the Zelensky regime in Ukraine is rapidly collapsing. The Russian advance is unstoppable. That which could have been negotiated in former times will not now be able to be negotiated. The end game of the Ukraine war, when an all-out war is raging in the Middle East, now became a very different end game indeed. Russia will not stop at the river Dnieper. Russia will not stop at Odessa or Kharkov. Russia will go on until the existential threat of NATO expansion on Ukrainian soil ceases to exist. So we appear to be hurtling. I'm about to speak to another religious man, Chris Hedges. We appear to be hurtling towards what may be the end of times. It feels that way to me. It feels that we're running out of time. I was studying Mars the other day as part of my case in Dublin on Monday against Elon Musk and Twitter. I happened to study Mars. More and more evidence is emerging, geological evidence is emerging, that Mars was once a civilization, you know. It isn't. Now, no trace of life on the planet can be found. We very well may be headed into the same territory. Chris Hedges, a wise owl if ever I saw one, political commentator, journalist, writer, and host of the inimitable Chris Hedges Report, joins me now from the United States. Chris, this is, it feels to me, a momentous evening. The scale and nature of the Israeli terrorist attack on Lebanon is likely to be a spark that brings the much discussed wider war in the Middle East, at least according to me. What about you?
Yes, and it follows a pattern. So if you know the history of Gaza as well as I do, but there would be an uneasy ceasefire, and Israel would break the ceasefire and carry out provocations that they knew would elicit a response by Hamas and other resistance groups, and we're seeing the same pattern here. Remember that these explosions came a day after the Israeli cabinet released a decision that a priority now was to return Israelis to the north. About 80,000 have been displaced. There have been reports in the Israeli press that there are disputes between the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, over a war in Lebanon. And then there have been rumors that Netanyahu will even dismiss Gallant and replace him with the far right politician Gideon Sarar. On Monday, the commander of the Israeli Northern Front recommended that the government conduct an offensive to create a buffer zone within the Lebanese southern Lebanon, and this takes place, of course, a month after Hezbollah launched a drone or rocket attack that targeted Israel's military intelligence headquarters near Tel Aviv. That attack was in retaliation for Israel's assassination of the top Hezbollah commander, Faoud Shakar, and this was in late July in Beirut. That assassination took place the next day. There was an assassination of Hamas's Politburo chief, Ismail Haniyeh. So we've now watched for several weeks these provocations by Israel. Israel knows very well that those provocations demand a response, but I think you're right. What we're seeing now is at a whole other level, talking about thousands of people. And remember, many of these people are not Hezbollah fighters. They may work for Hezbollah, but they work often in civilian infrastructure. These things were going off, exploding in supermarkets while people were driving cars. It killed children. Then, of course, today now we've had apparently walkie-talkies. So, yes, Israel provokes on purpose. This is a massive provocation. All signs are that there will be an incursion by Israeli forces into southern Lebanon, perhaps even once again a bombing of Beirut. This fits the pattern, both in terms of Israel's long animosity towards Hezbollah and Lebanon, but also its animosity towards the Palestinians in Gaza. But the consequences of this could be catastrophic. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm terrified for what comes next.
An Israeli incursion, as you put it, invasion, I said, will be, of course, hotly contested. The Lebanese resistance is very strong and numerous, and with a quite awesome firepower, according to Israeli sources themselves, quite apart from the fact they have powerful friends around the region. It is possible that an Israeli invasion of Lebanon could be their bloodiest ever, costliest ever invasion into an Arab country.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, both Iran and Hezbollah have actually acted up until now with amazing restraint. But yes, and it's interesting that the Israeli press reports are saying that the Israeli Ministry of Transportation officials are preparing for a potential attack on the port of Haifa and Ben Gurion Airport. That, of course, is something that we have not seen, something that would really begin to shut down the ability of Israel to operate. But I think the fact that Israeli officials are expecting something of that magnitude buttresses your point that this will be conducted at a level that we haven't yet seen. No, I don't think that Israel's success with an incursion is in any way assured. Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hamas's rockets, I mean, to be fair, are largely ineffectual, very small compared to the missile systems provided by Iran, of course, that Hezbollah possesses. So yes, if Hezbollah decides to go all out, then I think that the possibility of this ending very badly for Israel is likely.
Now, my government has been active on social media today. Ironically, on one of them I just saw, the Foreign Office said that they stood four square with the United States against cybercrime and hacking of electronic equipment. But they've been busy on other things, large and small. But none of the British government ministers have found a single word of condemnation of what by any measure is a terrorist attack, pregnant with the possibility that others will now copy it. Others with whom they're less chummy will now copy it. Is it the same in the US?
Yes. The irony is that you have that US mediator, Hochstein, who's in Israel right now, I think, attempting, well, according to the State Department, to diffuse tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. Well, you're not going to diffuse tensions between Israel and Hezbollah when over the last 2 days you've had thousands of people wounded, many quite seriously, many civilians. This is also fits this kind of pattern of Israel essentially running rogue, doing anything it wants, and the U.S., because of the Zionist lobby, which owns Congress, essentially being unable to curb the most rapacious and aggressive behavior by Israel, and of course, Israel expects that should it get into trouble with Iran, the United States will militarily intervene on its side. Now, I'd be wrong. I mean, Netanyahu has long tried to drag the United States into a conflict with Iran, just like the Israeli government dragged the United States into the Iraq War. That was a Zionist neoliberal or neoconservative project, which didn't end well for the United States, but managed to essentially break the one regional power that posed a serious threat to Israel, and that was the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein. So it served Israel's interests. It did not serve the interests of the United States, certainly not the interests within the region. So yeah, there's the consequences of this regionally for the United States and maybe ultimately for Israel are deeply distressing.
Now, it turns out to have been quite a simple affair. The only barrier really is whether you would do such a thing, not whether you could do such a thing. Motorola say they're completely innocent. They sold a license to what turned out to be a shell company in Hungary using a Middle East bank, intriguingly. And that company then produced Motorola goods, except they were filled with explosive. Anybody could do that, Chris, couldn't they? And now almost certainly they will.
Yeah, of course. It becomes another template. I think, there's no question this is an act of terrorism, state terrorism on the part of Israel. But yes, of course, once you begin to employ these acts of terror, you get copycat terror. I mean, remember, this is a few years ago, but I think it was ISIS captured a Jordanian pilot. And what did they do? They put the pilot in a cage and burned him alive, because that's what, of course, Jordanian and American and NATO planes were doing to them. So, yes, I mean, go all the way back to 9/11. The hijackers of 9/11 speak the language that we taught them. Which was massive explosions and death above a city skyline. We've been doing it since Vietnam, when Robert McNamara called the massive bombing campaign, the Christmas bombing campaign of North Vietnam, a way to, quote unquote, send a message to Hanoi. So I think you make an extremely important point that the atrocities we carry out are then often visited upon us. And yeah, I think that you're right. This is down the road. This will be something that will be visited on Israel and perhaps its allies.
They may have done it before, of course. I've been deeply skeptical about the helicopter crash that murdered the president of Iran and the foreign minister of Iran. I'm wondering if they had a pager or a Motorola radio in the helicopter.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Remember that, going back to the so-called bomb maker in Gaza, they were doing this with cell phones, which is why resistance groups switched away from the cell phones, not only because they were tracking devices and you could be monitored, but because we had already seen Israel use mobile devices or turn mobile devices into explosives.
What do you think the implications are for the electronics industry of all this? I posited in my introductory remarks that if you lived in the global south, if you lived in a country that the United States and the United Kingdom had bad relations with or even designated as an enemy, you'd have to be a fool to be carrying around Western technology in your pocket or in your car. Am I right?
Yeah, of course. Of course. And especially because there will be no accountability. You can be sure of that. So, yeah, I think it's just one more step, which we have seen in this kind of multipolar universe. And we can begin with all of the sanctions against Russia. You have seen a stepping away from that Western hegemony, not only within the banking system, but within the technology sector. So, yeah, I think this is one more step in the fragmentation of the world. I mean, why? You raise a completely legitimate point. Why could you ever trust these companies again? Especially as I cannot stress enough, the fact that nobody will be held, Israel, which probably clearly did it, is not going to be held accountable. Nobody's going to be held accountable.
Turning, if I may, finally, Chris, to the Ukraine. We're asking the question in our poll tonight, is Zelensky finished? Do you think he is?
I don't know. It's, the Ukrainian oligarchic system is pretty corrupt. And it's greased by money, of which apparently Zelensky has quite a bit. So I don't know. Well, I'm going to have to be an agnostic on that question.
Thank you very much, as always, Chris Hedges.
CBS News, at least, has learned that the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, spoke yesterday with the Israeli Defense Minister 2 different times. We've been told no specifics were given about the operation that happened yesterday. Was there any heads up given yesterday that there would be more attacks in Lebanon today?
Well, I'd refer you to the Defense Department to speak to conversations that the Secretary had with Minister Gallant. As I said, there was no U.S. involvement in either of these incidents, and I have nothing.
One thing, though, but awareness it was coming is another.
I recognize the question. I have nothing more to add.
If you're someone who owns a pager like this that's been blown up in Lebanon in recent days, whether it was made by the Taiwanese company or the Hungarian company that may have had a licensing deal with them, should you be concerned it could blow up?
Again, Ed, I have nothing more to add on this.
Yeah. Our sources have confirmed to us it's been widely reported that Israel is responsible for this, but notably you still won't say that. Why is that? Is it because that's not your assessment or because you don't support what they're doing here?
It's because I don't have anything more to add on this issue. As I said, there was no U.S. involvement, and I'm not going to go beyond that today.
Then let me ask this. These kinds of tactics, blowing up pagers and walkie-talkies, is this type of warfare acceptable to the United States?
Again, Mary, I appreciate the question. I'm simply not going to be able to address these incidents over the last couple of days in any level of detail one way or another.
Okay, let me try one other thing.
Please.
Everyone keeps urging, all parties involved not to escalate this. isn't this an escalation already? I mean, isn't this Israel doing exactly what you've been warning them not to do?
Again, I'm not going to speak to the details of these incidents. I understand that's frustrating. I get it. And I understand where all your questions are coming from. They're all valid. They're all fair. I'm just not going to get into this. I will add, if I could, and restate a little bit to what I said to Gabe. We still don't want to see an escalation of any kind. We don't believe that the way to solve where we're at in this crisis is by additional military operations at all. We still believe that the best way to prevent escalation, to prevent another front from opening up in Lebanon, is through diplomacy, which is why Mr. Hochstein was over in the region this week. And we're still going to pursue those kinds of outcomes.
He's just talking, even though reporters can see the U.S. is full of shit, allowing Israel to commit this terrorism that's going to blow up in their face. This is not an act of war. This is an act of terrorism.
If, say, Hamas or Hezbollah managed to simultaneously detonate the pages or mobile phones of Israeli reservists, whether or not they were on duty or not, wherever they happen to be, whoever happened to be around them, that would be rightly classified as an obscene act of mass terrorism. It would also rightly be judged to be a grave war crime. I'd also note that anyone who cheered on such an attack in the West would be liable for arrest under their country's anti-terror legislation. Now, today across Lebanon, and reportedly in Syria, pages suddenly exploded with reports that more than 4,000 people so far have been injured, with at least 11 killed, including one 8-year-old girl named Fatima Jafar Abdullah. The reported targets was Hezbollah, which is two things: a Lebanese militia and a political party, which is part of the governing coalition in Lebanon. But it's not just Hezbollah fighters who use these pages. Reportedly, so do medics. I mean, we need more information on that. That's what the questions will be asking. Who actually has these pages, and does Israel know? Can they be sure who these pages belong to? We'll talk about that. But one widely circulating claim is that Israel intercepted a shipment of pages and then put explosives in them, remotely detonating them. Hezbollah uses these pages, or relies on them rather than mobile phones, to prevent Israel monitoring their activities. The other possibility I've seen being discussed is some sort of cyber attack to remotely blow up these pages using their batteries. I'm not a tech expert here, but it strikes me as extremely implausible, especially given these pages appear to be primitive. If that were true, well, the implications of that would be even more terrifying, though they are terrifying enough, as we'll discuss. Now, apologists for Israel are in a frenzy of ecstasy over this. One example is Avi Meyer. He used to be the editor-in-chief of Jerusalem Post. He says, note, there are exactly 0 reports of anyone but Hezbollah personnel being wounded by the exploding pages. Whoever carried this ingenious attack did so in a manner that specifically targeted the Hezbollah men and spared uninvolved civilians. Let's remember that. Now, Avi Meyer has a history of denial when it comes to the killing of children. He was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post when they posted false, disgusting claims that Palestinian parents were faking the deaths, the murders, the killing of their babies by Israeli weapons by using dolls. That's who this guy is. He's walked back this claim now. We have the confirmation, obviously, of at least one child being killed. But this underlines that this claim, it's a highly targeted attack on a terrorist group, is a nonsense. We can see the consequences. Indeed, I've watched the CTV footage of 2 attacks. I won't share them because otherwise YouTube will age restrict this video. One shows someone paying at a supermarket, paying for their goods, then the page explodes, clearly injuring people around them, and another in a market. You can see the same again. I can't show you the video, though, the consequences, because otherwise YouTube will age restrict this video and then limit the number of people who can watch it. But I can show you this video of the consequences of the pager explosion in someone's home.
Hello. وين الشيخ؟ لك الشيخ مو بايجر جديدة؟ الشيخ مو بايجر جديدة ولا قديمة؟
Well, you can see there that caused significant damage. You can see how if this exploded on a person, it could cause serious injuries and deaths to other people, in particular if the reports are true that the attack happened after they received a message. So many would have taken the page out first. Now, you just have to ask yourself some basic questions about this attack, or rather series of attacks. And that's actually important. This is a series of attacks. By what definition are these targeted, legitimate military attacks? We know that Israel has an all-encompassing definition, for example, of Hamas, where junior officials, civil servants, public administrators, and so on are defined as Hamas and thus judged to be legitimate targets and thus attacked, even if that kills their entire families. In this case, Hezbollah is a political party, as well as a militia, which is part of the internationally recognized government in Lebanon. Do we know who exactly has these pages? What is the legality of the attempt to commit the mass extrajudicial killing of so many people with no regard for what they have or have not done? And how is it at all possible to take any precautions to protect other people? Well, you can't, can you? Think of someone sitting on a crowded bus or train. Think of people driving cars or other vehicles. Think of people in public spaces like a supermarket. Everyone with a pager turns into a walking explosive and becomes a threat to everyone around them. According to the Geneva Conventions, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. Indiscriminate attacks are those which are not directed at a specific military objective, those which employ a method or means of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, or those which employ a method or means of combat, the effects of which cannot be limited as required by this protocol. Well, you cannot possibly argue that this meets the terms of the Geneva Conventions. Now, a few things here. We all know what would happen if Israel had been on the receiving end of such an attack or series of attacks. If the phones or pages of Israeli reservists were attacked like this by Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran and exploded wherever those soldiers happen to be and killed and maimed children and bystanders, those cheering on this attack would be denouncing this as a despicable, outrageous act of terrorism. I would agree with them. If there was a similar attack on Israeli reservists as they went about their business in civilian areas, posing a grievous threat to those around them, I would condemn that as grievous terrorism. Some of us are morally consistent, you see. And this really does underline how terrorism is a term which is cynically redefined to mean violence used by the West's opponents. You see, when I pointed out on social media that this would be denounced as terrorism, were, say, Hezbollah the perpetrators and Israel the target, Israel's apologists responded en masse to say, yeah, but that's because Hezbollah are terrorists. Well, if Hezbollah had committed such an attack, the method of the violence and the consequences of the violence would be portrayed as central evidence that Hezbollah are terrorists. Terrorism is defined here by whether the violence is perpetrated by an opponent of the West. If it's committed by an opponent of the West, then it's terrorism. If it's done by Israel, then it's just a daring attack. You see, the hideous consequence of this can be seen. One doctor in Beirut reports, I smelled too much blood today and tried to stop many slaughtered body parts from bleeding, which was pointless. What we are going through is unbelievable. A Lebanese Amnesty International campaigner, Bissan Fakir, reports, my family and friends in Sur described surreal and shocking scenes, people running through the streets, women hitting their faces, mass confusion and hysteria, ambulances racing by, rescue workers crying. It's also worth noting here that the horrors the Israeli state has perpetrated against Lebanon go back decades. Like during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, when the Republican president, Ronald Reagan, was so disgusted at the horrors being perpetrated by the Israeli army that he rang the Israeli defense minister to announce what he called a Holocaust. We're also currently in the midst of the anniversary of the days-long Sabra and Shatila massacre, when up to 3,500 Palestinian and Lebanese Shia civilians were massacred in Lebanon by Israel's allies, which the Israeli defense minister was found culpable for by an Israeli commission. This makes me think of the Dahir doctrine, developed by the Israeli state in 2006, which basically pushed for attacking civilian infrastructure, civilian targets, so civilians would turn against Hezbollah because of the price they were paying. That is terrorism, where you terrorize civilians for political objectives. Now, I seriously believe the Israeli state thought through the terror this would undoubtedly cause amongst civilians in Lebanon in an attempt to make them think that they must turn on Hezbollah in order to achieve the political end of rolling back the tide against Hezbollah. Now, this also further degrades international law. We are seeing the constant mainstreaming of serious war crimes by Israel, supported, made possible by the West, which will collapse the already disintegrating international order. Human rights abusing despots and organizations will all take note of this precedent now it has been granted the de facto legitimacy of the West. We're also staring through the portal of a dystopian future where technology can be harnessed so that anyone can be instantly located and targeted and killed. I fear this is where we are heading, and you can see how an inescapable totalitarian world could be built that way one day, where anyone who resists those forces with technology that just takes out anyone they deem an opponent like that. I mean, where's that technology going to be in 20, 30 years? Think it through. In any case, this is a terrorist attack. It is a terrorist attack, a deeply disturbing terrorist attack with hideous consequences. And we can see that Israel is attempting to stoke potentially a regional war with catastrophic consequences, and we're already seeing a catastrophe as is. As ever, the message is sent out to the world. Arab life doesn't matter. Well, a bitter harvest is being sown, and we will reap it for generations to come. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts.
I'm Amy Goodman. In Lebanon, at least 12 people were killed, over 2,800 injured Tuesday when electronic pagers used by members of Hezbollah exploded at the same time. It was about 3:30 in the afternoon. Israel's widely believed to be behind the attack. Hezbollah vowed to retaliate against Israel as fears grow of a broader regional war. According to a report by Reuters, Israel's Mossad spy agency had managed to plant explosive material in a batch of pagers bought in recent months by Hezbollah. The pagers were sold under the name of the Taiwanese brand Gold Apollo, but the company said the pagers were actually made by a firm in Budapest that had a license to use Gold Apollo name. Victims of the attack included a 10-year-old girl who died when her father's pager exploded. The Iranian ambassador to Mujtaba Amani was also injured by an exploding pager. The New York Times reports he lost an eye in the blast. The nature of the simultaneous attack shocked many in Lebanon.
What happened yesterday shocked us. It was unimaginable. No one could have thought that pagers could explode like that. The scene was shocking, how people were torn apart right in front of you.
Hezbollah relied on pagers in part to avoid Israel's surveillance of other communication networks like cell phones. Lebanese lawmaker Tony Frange Jr. condemned the attack as an act of terrorism.
Catastrophic repercussions for the crisis today, but this, as I have previously explained with several stations, is terrorism being practiced against Lebanon. And we, and I believe the majority of the Lebanese people, do not submit to the language of terrorism.
Earlier today, U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken said the U.S. did not know about nor was involved in what he called, quote, these incidents. Blinken made the comments in Cairo, Egypt, where he held a joint news conference with the Egyptian foreign minister and met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Axios reports Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin shortly before the operation began. We go now to Beirut, Lebanon, where we're joined by independent Lebanese journalist Mohammed Klait. Thanks so much for being with us. Mohammed, can you describe the scene yesterday at 3:30?
Thank you very much for having me. we're still in a sort of state of shock of what happened. We didn't comprehend what was going on until later hours at night. What happened at 3:30 exactly? Certain sounds of small explosions were happening in the streets of the southern suburbs, specifically. People yelling at the street. People were in a state of shock. There were some of them who were not targeted by this terrorist attack, were in a state of they were frozen in the streets, not knowing what was going on. It was very hard to comprehend, to make sense of what was happening. Then later on, people started helping the people who were injured, who where these pages exploded on their waists or even their hands or in front of their faces, taking them to hospitals because they were falling down on the street by the thousands. As the Minister of Health has counted, around 1,850 persons were injured in the southern suburbs alone, or in Beirut in general. There were around 2,000 persons who were admitted to hospitals, around 450 persons who were critically injured in the faces and the eyes. While on the street, people until now are still making sense of what was happening. Even until late at night, people were still on the streets, still trying to get people who were injured from their houses, from the cafes, from the supermarkets, from all the civilian buildings where these pages have exploded, trying to admit them to hospitals, trying to donate blood for those who have lost it.
And the number of people killed and wounded, and the people who were killed, we just reported on an 8-year-old girl. Can you go more into this, Mohammed?
Yes. So far, there have been 13 persons who were killed. 10 of them who are direct personnel of Hezbollah, whether they be affiliated with Hezbollah or they might be contractors as well. Because from what and there are also 3 other civilians, a mother and the little girl that you talked about, who was I think she's 9 years old, and there's also a young boy who's 11 years old who passed away late at night. Hezbollah, from what I know, that these pagers are used by Hezbollah basically by the people who are medics, who work in logistics, not the people who work. Very few of them who work in the military sector of Hezbollah use these pagers.
I'd like to bring a guest into the conversation who is an expert on investigating human rights abuses, Ramzi Qais, Human Rights Watch researcher investigating human rights abuses in Lebanon. He's joining us from Geneva. Ramzi, thanks so much for being with us. Can you explain what you understand technically happened and talk about it in the context of an international human rights framework?
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for having me. As you noted, and as Mohammed noted, yesterday there was scenes of just chaos and shock in Lebanon as thousands of pagers exploded simultaneously across the country, resulting in thousands of people being injured. According to the Ministry of Health, at least 12 people have been killed. This includes 2 children and aid workers, and at least 2,800 people have been injured. Now, photos and videos that we reviewed that were taken by witnesses to the attack or victims showed pagers exploding in public places such as grocery stores or supermarkets, and other videos that appear to be linked to the attack that took place, taken from emergency rooms, showed adults and children in emergency rooms with truly severe, traumatic, and penetrating injuries. We saw injuries to the head, to the torso, to the limbs, with many people who had decapitated fingers, in addition to other injuries that appear to be consistent with the detonation of high explosives. Now, we know that Hezbollah, in a statement that they issued, said that these pages had belonged to various units and institutions within Hezbollah. They blamed the Israeli government. And we know from the various media reports that have come out, with citing former Israeli officials and U.S. officials saying that Israel is responsible for the attack. But the Israeli military has not commented as of yet, at least according to my knowledge. Looks like there needs to be a full and prompt investigation into how the attack unfolded that should be conducted. But what we know from the perspective of international humanitarian law on the way in which this attack took place, the law of armed conflict is clear. It prohibits the use of booby traps or other apparently harmless portable devices that civilians could be attracted to, or that civilians use precisely in order to avoid the harm that we saw unfold in Beirut yesterday, with the devastating scenes of thousands of people being rushed to the hospital at the same time, including children, including civilians. When an explosive device is used or implanted in something such as a pager, where this device, its location cannot be reliably determined, where the means of attack or the method in which the attack takes place cannot differentiate between civilians or combatants, it cannot be directed at a specific military target, and which would strike military targets and civilians alike without distinguishing between them. This is an unlawfully indiscriminate attack, and it's unlawful under the laws of war. And there needs to be accountability for this violations and for other violations, because as we've seen, there has been continued impunity for violations of the laws of war in Lebanon. Human Rights Watch has documented apparently deliberate attacks on civilians, on journalists, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, widespread use of white phosphorus included on populated areas, and the use of U.S. weapons unlawfully against aid workers. And without accountability for such violations, they will continue with impunity. We've previously called on various countries such as the US and other countries to suspend arms sales and military assistance to Israel in light of the fact that they could be used unlawfully in violations of IHL, as we are seeing unfold in the country.
An NSA whistleblower, Edward Snowden, tweeted following the attacks, quote, "What Israel has just done is via any method reckless. They blew up countless numbers of people who were driving, meaning cars out of control, shopping, your children are in the stroller standing behind them in the checkout line, etc. Indistinguishable from terrorism." Ramzi, your response?
Yeah, I mean, in the videos that we reviewed, you could clearly see these devices go off in supermarkets, where civilians were nearby, the children were nearby, and the attacks happen at the same time. And so, when you use explosive devices that are not able to distinguish between or specifically target a military object, and they're indiscriminate and could cause harm to civilians as well as the military target, that would amount to an indiscriminate attack, and that is unlawful under the laws of war, and should be investigated as a violation of IHL. And for those reasons, there needs to be not just an investigation, but accountability for such violations, or we will continue to see violations unfold with impunity.
On Tuesday, European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell warned about the risk of a broader regional war.
I was in Lebanon before coming to Emirates. I was visiting the United Nations troops in the border. When I came there, the level of danger was increasing, and I see the troops going to their barracks. Certainly, there is a possibility of the war be spilling over, not only to Lebanon, but also it's already being important fire in the Red Sea, where we, the European Union, has deployed a Navy mission in order to protect the freedom of navigation. The risk of a spillover is not from yesterday, it's from the beginning. And we have to do all our efforts in order to try to avoid the regionalization of the war in Gaza.
So that's Josep Borrell, EU chief, the European Union. Rami Khouri is also with us in Boston, Palestinian-American journalist, senior public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. Rami, you have repeatedly said you do not believe what was happening in Gaza would lead to a broader regional war. What are your thoughts today on what happened yesterday and where this is all headed?
Yeah, thanks for having me. There's so many dimensions to this, and most of the discussion that we're all involved in is based on speculation and assumptions, and we have to be really careful to wait till we get verifiable facts, and then we can have a better idea. But for the moment, I think I would say the following. I still believe that Hezbollah, Israel, Iran, Hamas and others want to avoid a all-out, free-for-all war between people in the region, which would probably include the U.S. if Iran gets involved. We saw a couple of months ago that Israel cannot defend itself by itself. It needs Arab support. It needs big-time American support on the spot, and it needs significant aid of money and weapons and other things. So I still believe an all-out regional war is going to be avoided because everybody realizes it wouldn't solve anything. It would just create massive suffering and more openings for terror groups and armed non-state actors as well, etc. That's what happens when you have chaos. What we do have is a regional low-intensity conflict going on. It's been going on for about a year or so, and Hezbollah and Israel are the key points of this, but Hamas is involved, the Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen are involved, and others. Iran indirectly is involved, and the U.S. indirectly through Israel is involved. What the Israeli attack using the pagers did is completely throw out the rule book on two things. One, as the previous guest said, the rules of war are irrelevant. They've always been irrelevant to Israel and the Zionist movements before the creation of Israel. They've done whatever they needed to do, they say, to protect themselves. The world says there's rules of wars to deal with that. But the Israelis have always ignored it. But they've also now thrown out the rules of engagement that Hezbollah and Israel have applied really since 2006, the last big war between them. I was in Beirut for that, and I experienced it, and I know the feeling that's prevalent all over Lebanon now is something I've experienced several times. And that was the point of what the Israelis wanted to do. They wanted to traumatize and terrorize the entire civilian population. They wanted to shock the Hezbollah institutions, and they wanted to basically destabilize the country to the point where if the Israelis wanted to go into South Lebanon in a big way, they would lay the groundwork for that. But at the same time, I think you have to keep remembering, in the last 3-4 months, we've had Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Israel, and the Ansarullah in Yemen with their supersonic missile or whatever it's called, the big-time missile that went right into Israel undetected from Yemen. They've all been broadcasting, showcasing their technical capabilities. In other words, sending a message to the other that we want to avoid a full war because we have huge capabilities that we haven't used yet, and this is something you all want to avoid. Israel just did its part in that drama, showing the capabilities that it has. The thing that is fascinating to me and important and still unclear is that Israel had to prepare for this months and months ahead of time. And we'll get more details on that soon. But this suggests that this kind of an operation was probably the prelude to a big land and air attack, I'm assuming. But because they wouldn't just do this by itself and drop it probably, but we'll see. We don't know the details. But the Israelis have talked about Hezbollah for several years as their main threat, their main concern in the region. Hamas and others are secondary. They see Hezbollah both as a threat because of its power and its disruption in the north of Israel, and because of its very direct links with Iran. And they've talked about trying to break it up, destroy it, push it back from the border. They keep coming up with all kinds of different ideas, none of which are clear, and almost none of which are within its capabilities. So there's so many unknown factors, but we can say that all sides have tremendous capabilities, technological and other. They're prepared to use them. They're prepared to risk an all-out war in the region, which they would try to contain in the region without getting, say, the U.S. and Iran involved. And we don't know if this is all, if the Israelis did this mainly to put pressure on the Lebanese and Hezbollah to accept the Israeli terms for the new terms of engagement, which is to push Hezbollah back from the Lebanon-Israel border about 10 miles or so. It's possible that this is just a short-term measure that Israel is trying to achieve. So I think we have to take all of these things into consideration. The last point I make is nothing that happened yesterday and today or in the last few months is really new, but the scale of it is much bigger than anything that's happened before. Israel and Hezbollah and others have used technology to kill each other and terrorize each other for decades. Terrorizing civilians is a stable Israeli policy for many years, and none of it is really new, but the scale of it now is what's kind of scary. And because the Israel-U.S. combination is now actively exchanging fire with 5 or 6 parties all around the Middle East and facing a huge global swell of support for a ceasefire in Gaza and for a Palestinian state, there are serious political pressures that might even influence the American presidential election outcome, possibly in the swing states. These are signs that the scale of the actions and the scale of the consequences are far higher than ever before. And if you take it, you say, why is this? I would say this: the one main reason. There are many, but the one main reason is that the U.S. and the Western world has allowed the right-wing Israeli governments of the last 15, 20 years to do anything they want in terms of settlements, imprisoning thousands of Palestinians, killing people, now a plausible genocide. Israel can do anything it wants, kill as many people, ignore as many laws, terrorize as many people as it wants, dehumanize as many people as it wants. It will suffer no consequences. This is something quite extraordinary, and the world has to somehow come to grips with this.
I wanted to go back to Beirut for a moment. Victims of Israel's pager attack included, I guess she's 10 years old, a little girl named Fatima Jafar Abdullah.
Pager attack was yesterday. Today was the laptop walkie-talkie attack.
Killed when her father's pager exploded, and now also confirmed a young boy named Bilal Khanj has not survived his injuries after the Israeli pager attack in Lebanon. He becomes the second child to be killed. And I wanted to go back to the journalist Mohammed Klait to ask about how widespread these pagers are in Lebanon, and about the use of pagers specifically to avoid Israel's surveillance of specifically cell phones.
Okay, so there are two catches in this. The first part is that this new batch that Hezbollah has ordered for these pagers, as you have mentioned before, that it's a Taiwanese-made pager, but they got it from a Bulgarian company that uses the same name of the Taiwanese company, or has the rights to use the name. As the investigations or journalistic investigations have shown, that Israel has intercepted this cargo of around 4,000 to 5,000 pagers, and they have tampered with it and detonated them alongside placing eavesdropping devices inside of them. And as Dr. Khouri has mentioned, that it was a weapon that they wanted to use during a full-on scale attack or maybe a land attack on Lebanon. But as we have seen 2 days ago, this plot was exposed by certain technicians in Hezbollah, and you know, my personal sources have said that because this plot was exposed and they were working on getting rid of them, and during an investigation that they were doing on these pages, that's why Israel has detonated these pages in a sudden way and caused this chain attack on people and on civilians and military personnel of Hezbollah. And
Mohammed, just a quick correction.
Second
Just a
catch,
quick
why do
correction.
they?
On it was a Budapest-based, it was a Hungary-based company. I'm looking at the Reuters report. The model of pagers used in detonations in Lebanon were made by a Budapest-based BAC Consulting. The Taiwanese pager firm Gold Apollo said on Wednesday, adding it had only licensed out its brand to the company and was not involved in the production of the devices. But keep going, Mohammed.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think I said Bulgaria, not Budapest. Yeah, and as for the second part, why do they still use the pagers? Hezbollah General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah has said before that there's a huge danger in using cell phones, smartphones that are connected to the Wi-Fi and to the global internet, on the safety of the combatants of Hezbollah in the south, as well as the civilian usage of these phones when they are filming in videos the locations of where the missiles and the rockets are coming out and the fields and in the valleys and so on, because this is when it's being spread on social media or being distributed and shared on WhatsApp or other applications. This is giving intelligence information for the Israelis, whom are later on bombing these locations of the videos that are being widespread. So there were internal orders by Hezbollah to not use smartphones, to try to disconnect them when possible from the internet and from the Wi-Fi connections. So they have relied on these on this new batch of pagers that they had, but as I've mentioned, that they were tampered with and intercepted and tampered with by the Israeli Mossad. And we saw what happened yesterday.
And are people still going to hospitals to give blood?
And I wanted to also. And I just wanted to add something for what Mr. Kais has said concerning that Israel is using booby traps, which are illegal based on international law. That during the 90s, I still remember when we used to go to the south during the Israeli occupation of the southern Lebanon, Israel used to drop baby toys that were booby traps, and they have small explosive devices. They used to drop them from military helicopters in the valleys on the streets of the villages where little kids were used to pick them up, and then they would explode. That's why we have seen many people from my generation from the 90s that there are either arms are amputated or there are missing a leg because of this illegal usage or illegal forms of warfare.
And the hospital, the issue of the hospitals and people going to give blood. Again, thousands and thousands of people have been injured, nearly 3,000, it's believed at this point, Mohammed.
Yes, and as I've mentioned earlier, that these pagers are used by medical personnel, logistics, some of the military personnel of Hezbollah. I know some of the persons that I talked to yesterday that they were at a clinic, and two of the doctors had these pagers and they blew up on their waist. One of them had his fingers amputated, the other had minor injuries. And we've seen this huge influx of people trying to donate blood because, as the Ministry of Health has said, there are roughly 2,800 persons who were injured. As I've mentioned as well, 1,850 only in Beirut. The huge state of chaos or medical chaos that we have seen in the city, particularly is out of this world. It's sort of like something from a sci-fi movie. But we have seen this huge state of cohesion and support from Lebanese in general. That they have went from, they came from different parts of the country, from far sides of the country, just to donate blood. Doctors and nurses came from bordering areas to the city, and to Baalbek in the east, and also to Nabatieh and Tyre in the south, to support the hospitals because they had a shortage of medical staff. And also to donate blood for the people who were injured, creating these blood banks in the streets, as we have also are seeing today, because it's a huge case of chaos, and sadly we don't have the proper medical infrastructure because of the crises that we have been through since 2019, and there's no proper plan of emergency to be implemented by the government. So people are trying to organize themselves in order to ease the crisis that we are in right now.
Well, Mohammed Khaled, I want to thank you so much for being with us.
Ever since October 7th, I have interviewed all sorts of people, experts in the region, scholars and the like, journalists who cover the region as well. And one of the things that many, if not most of them, have repeatedly said is that one of the most dangerous risks of the Israeli war with Gaza, the all-out war with Gaza that is now spreading to the West Bank, is that there are a lot of people in Israel who don't just want war with the Gazans or the Palestinians, but also really want war with Hezbollah on their north. They have disputed territory that are part of the Golan Heights that they've had for a long time, which Lebanon claims, which the Israelis claim, which the Syrians claim. Israel has made brutal incursions into Lebanon and all sorts of bombing raids on Lebanon, including on Beirut, some really brutal and deadly ones. And Hezbollah sees itself as a defensive force to keep Israel out of Lebanon. They have been having all sorts of border skirmishes since the beginning of the war, with Hezbollah sending some rockets, by no means their most sophisticated or damaging ones, into northern Israel primarily, and then the Israelis sniping back. But increasingly over the last couple of weeks, with Benjamin Netanyahu's government seemingly falling apart, and with increasing pressure on him to end the war and bring the hostages home, that's the war in Gaza, and with his obvious determination to continue the war as a way of staying in power and therefore out of prison, which he might be waiting him because of a corruption trial that he has been immune from while president, there's been a growing sense that Israel not only wants to provoke a war with Hezbollah, wants an all-out war with Hezbollah on its north, but also involve the United States in that war, which the United States has made very clear by deploying military assets to the region, by promising through Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton that it would do everything to defend Israel, including in a war of this kind. So if Israel does provoke Hezbollah successfully into a war with it, as many comments throughout this last week from the Israeli government and various officials have suggested they intend to do, that won't just involve a new front in the Israeli war in the north, and they have very exhausted reserves and fighters who have spent a year now in Gaza fighting, often street to street, against Hamas, which continues to flourish whenever the Israelis leave, but they would then open a front against the much more effective fighting force in Lebanon that is Hezbollah. And so it's hard to understand why this would be in Israel's interest, other than because it's in the Netanyahu government's interest. But the Israelis carried out an attack today that was really unprecedented in terms of the way it was carried out, but also in terms of just the indiscriminate damage and casualties that took place. It was, you've got to give credit where due, quite ingenious, although we need to figure out exactly how it was carried out before we can give that kind of credit. But certainly it was a sophisticated operation, as I said, an unprecedented one. The Wall Street Journal earlier today explained it well in this headline: Hezbollah pagers explode in apparent attack across Lebanon. 8 people were killed and 2,750 wounded, the country's health minister said. Now, this is earlier today. Those numbers have been updated, as usually happens in cases like this. There's certainly more than 3,000 reported deaths. I've seen 4,000 from various people on the ground, journalists and the like, and hospitals. There's at least 4,000 casualties. That death number has gone up to at least 12, including a couple of children. So we'll see what the death toll and what the casualty toll actually ends up being once everything is sort of processed. But here's the Wall Street Journal's reporting, quote, the affected pagers were from a new shipment that the group received in recent days. People familiar with the matter said a Hezbollah official said many fighters had such devices, speculating that malware might have caused the devices to explode. The official said some people felt the pagers heat up and disposed of them before they burst. Hezbollah and the Lebanese government blamed Israel for the attack. Both said civilians were killed, and Hezbollah threatened to retaliate. The Israeli military declined to comment. Lebanese Health Minister Faraz Abiad, appearing on Al Jazeera television, said exploding pagers across the country injured 2,750 people and killed 8, including a child. The government and hundreds were in critical condition. Now, one of the things I think is very important to note is that Hezbollah is similar to the Taliban in the sense that you cannot isolate who's a member of the Taliban and who isn't. The Taliban is basically a integrated part of the Afghan population. And then you have people who are official fighters of it. You have people who are supportive of it, particularly when there's a foreign army invading, people who are kind of tangential to it, but still work with the Taliban because it's the governing body in a lot of areas. It's the same for Hezbollah. And so even if it were true, and it's clearly not, given the death of children and all sorts of people in civilian areas, that the only people injured were quote unquote Hezbollah fighters or people associated with Hezbollah, that would still include a lot of people who are not fighters, who work with the governing group or the group that's considered Lebanon's protection from Israel. But clearly it was far more indiscriminate than that. We're going to show you that in just a bit in terms of where it happened, how many people were affected, what kinds of people. The State Department spokesman Matthew Miller was asked today about what role, if any, the U.S. had in this attack, and here's what he said.
Well, just to begin with, in general, what does the U.S. know about what happened? There have been a series of deaths and injuries, apparently from exploding pagers. Was the U.S. have any knowledge? What does it know now, and when did it know about what has happened?
So we are gathering information on this incident. I can tell you that the U.S. was not involved in it. The U.S. was not aware of this incident in advance, and at this point, we're gathering information.
And what information have you gathered so far?
We'll continue to collect information. I don't have any public readout to give now, but we're collecting information in the same way that journalists are across the world to gather the facts about what might have happened.
Now, that's just insultingly deceitful. The U.S. government is gathering information the same way journalists are. The U.S. government is the government on whom Israel depends for their funding, for the payment of their military, for the arming of their wars. Obviously, the U.S. government has the easy, direct, immediate means of finding out, quote unquote, what happened here and who was responsible by picking up the phone and calling the Israelis and demanding that they explain to them what it is that they did. He kind of smirks as he said, like, hey, we don't know anything. We're figuring out like you are. We're waiting. We're doing some journalism, figuring things out. That's preposterous. Everything the Israeli military does, everything, or its intelligence agencies do, has U.S. involvement by virtue of the fact that none of that could happen without the U.S. worker paying for it by force through taxation policies and then transferring billions and billions of dollars to Israel, or billions and billions of weapons that the American taxpayer also pays for. Just to give you a sense for, in case you are imagining that these pagers went off on some sort of battlefield where a bunch of uniformed Hezbollah fighters were, here from Reuters is just a very illustrative video of the kind of places that it happened and where it happened. If you don't like seeing violent scenes, I would encourage you to look away. But for those who want to get a sense for how this was carried out and who it affected and the kind of civilian infrastructure in which it took place, here's a video that is clearly at a kind of fruit market where there's a bunch of civilians and employees sweeping up, people shopping for produce and the like. And then one of the people there had one of these pagers. I mean, so that explosion was not a joke. If you have a pager like that in your pocket or in your hand, it's going to blow off a limb, at least. That's why you have at least hundreds of people severely injured and some untold number dead. Now, among the injured, according to Reuters, was the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon, which, according to this headline, was injured by one of those pager explosions. Quote, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon, Mushtabi Amani, was slightly injured on Tuesday by the explosion of an electronic pager, Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported, as numerous such devices exploded across Lebanon. Quote, Amani has a superficial injury and is currently under observation in a hospital, Fars quoted a source as saying. Now, note that about a month ago, everyone thought, because the Iranians were insisting, that they were going to retaliate in a very serious way against Israel as a result of the killing of a Hamas leader inside Iran that Iran had invited as a guest of their inauguration of the new president. And obviously, if some foreign country carries out a murder of a guest that you invite, of a leader of some group or some country onto your soil, it's a violation of your sovereignty. And if everyone sees it and you do nothing, then you're essentially signaling that that's not a red line for you, that you're either scared to or unwilling to or unable to retaliate in any meaningful way. And so Iran was making very clear that they would retaliate seriously, not in a sort of way calculated, not to do much damage. It's when they shot those slow, primitive drones and other weapons after the Israelis bombed their embassy in Damascus, knowing that they would be shot out of the sky very easily as they were. Kind of just a symbolic retaliation. But in this case, they vowed retaliation and they have not done anything apparently. And of course, Hezbollah is now vowing the same. Here from Reuters also today, Hezbollah vows to punish Israel after pager explosion across Lebanon. Quote, Lebanon's Hezbollah promised to retaliate after blaming Israel for detonating pagers on Tuesday that killed at least 8 people and wounded 2,750 others, including many of the militant group's fighters and Iran's envoy to Beirut. Lebanese Information Minister Zaid Makari condemned the detonation of the pagers used by Hezbollah and others in Lebanon to communicate as a, quote, Israeli aggression. Hezbollah said Israel would receive, quote, its fair punishment for the blast. The Israeli military, which has been engaged in cross-border warfare with Iran-backed Hezbollah since the start of the Gaza war last October, declined to respond to Reuters' questions about the detonations. Now, it should be noted that unlike Hamas, which has some capacity to attack inside Israel, but not a very sophisticated capacity, Hezbollah has extremely serious missile capability, very large, destructive, precise missiles that not only can reach into northern Israel, which has been the area where Hezbollah has typically been aiming its missiles over the last year, and prior to that, based on the idea that part of northern, what's called what the Israelis consider northern Israel is actually occupied territory, but they have the capacity to strike very destructively in major Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv. Now, obviously, if they were to do that, there'd be a massive response from the Israelis, but you can provoke a war of that kind at some point, especially a humiliating attack like this. You have a very good chance of provoking a serious reaction, although Iran had repeatedly vowed and people expected that Iran would do so, and then they didn't. Now, some of the reactions from Israel's most fanatical supporters in the United States are so telling. Even as they were hearing that the casualty count was in the thousands, even as they were hearing that it injured or severely or killed young children, they couldn't hide their giddiness, their glee. They're so happy, especially over the psychosexual part of this attack, namely that, Hezbollah fighters had their testicles blown off. This was a major source of celebration from these kind of deranged supporters of Israel who often express their views in that manner. Hear from Eric Reiner, who is a very wealthy hedge fund manager, although he is an American citizen born in the United States. This is what he said, quote, "We were inside of Hania's bedroom," referring to the killing of the Hamas leader in Israel, "and now we are inside of Nasrallah's pants," referring to the Hezbollah leader. So we were inside of his bedroom and now we're inside his pants. Now, the disturbing psychosexual imagery of that is obvious. No one needs to point it out, but The question I had and I asked, I haven't gotten an answer from him yet, is congratulations, who is the we in these two sentences? You're talking about an American citizen who apparently considers the we, not his own country, not the American government, that he is subject to and supposed to be loyal to as a citizen, but apparently Israel is someone that he considers we. I think obviously there are a lot of American Jews and American evangelicals who think that same way, even though under this new law that the House passed, that the Senate is preparing to pass, one of the prohibited ideas that would be constituted as anti-Semitism under this new free speech attack to protect Israel, as we've covered when the House passed it, is one of the ideas that is now off limits that would be instantly deemed anti-Semitic, is to suggest that any American Jews have equal loyalty to or more loyalty to Israel than they do to the United States, even though so many of them say exactly that, admit that, make that so clear. Here is a official account of the Israeli war room, and they simply posted the phone emoji, obviously taunting and celebrating the people who they blew up today. Here's Ben Shapiro speaking of American Jews who have at least as much loyalty, if not more so, to Israel. I'm going to say that while it's still legal. And he went on Twitter and said, quote, breaking, Hezbollah has been forced to rename itself Hezbollah after losing all of its balls. So you kind of see the nature of this attack and the reason why it's arousing so many of Israel's most fanatical supporters, even if you think it's a justified attack, knowing that there were so many civilians who were injured or killed should, in any decent person, preclude this kind of celebration. But these people are the opposite of decent. Speaking of whom, Konstantin Kizin, who is a British and Jewish supporter of Israel, to say, put that mildly, said, quote, what use is 72 virgins when you have no balls? The longtime American Eli Lake, also fanatical supporter of Israel, said, can't talk right now, my pager's blowing up. So they were having a lot of fun with this show of strength, and obviously they identify very much with Israel. Even though they're not Israeli citizens, nominally, they're citizens of the US or the UK. It's probably one of the most deranged people, but I don't even think he's more deranged. I think he just hides it less, is the actor Michael Rappaport, who has become one of the most obnoxious and vocal, attention-seeking supporters of Israel. And as the news proliferated today that there were thousands of casualties, including children killed, this is what he went onto his phone and then social media to do. Beep, beep. Beep, beep. Beep, beep. All right, if these people are just deranged, they're degenerates to respond to violence, including the death of children, in that manner. Here is the reaction of Edward Snowden, who particularly has an interest in things like mobile devices and telephones. That was a big part of his work. And he was very disturbed in particular by the way in which now not just our devices are vulnerable to surveillance or to malware that can allow governments or non-state actors to monitor and surveil everything that we do, which is something they do try to do, but also now the vulnerability that this shows that just ordinary supply chains have in terms of you can purchase devices at any sort of retail store, and it may now be the case that that has been turned into a remote weapon. They may not be targeting you, but obviously when you send a bunch of rigged, bombed devices inside Lebanon, you're obviously realizing that there's a good chance that you may end up having those purchased by people who have nothing to do with Hezbollah, who are very ancillary to Hezbollah, which seems to be the case. And here's what he said, quote, what Israel has just done is via any method reckless. They blew up countless numbers of people who were driving, meaning cars out of control, shopping, your children are in the stroller standing behind him in the checkout line, etc., indistinguishable from terrorism. And he had added earlier, quote, as information comes in about the exploding beepers in Lebanon, it seems now more likely than not to be implanted explosive, not a hack. Why? Too many consistent, very serious injuries. If it were overheated batteries exploding, you'd expect much more small fires and misfires. And I think he turned out to be right based on all the sort of reporting that we've been able to see about exactly how this was done. Now, it remains to be seen where these devices came from. There are suggestions that they came from a Taiwanese tech company, which would suggest that the United States, which of course is the case, is very integrated, well integrated into the Taiwanese tech and defense industry, and the Israelis are as well. There was other suggestions that it came from Motorola, which has a long and notorious history of working with the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Pentagon and the intelligence community. So we're going to find out what the exact supply chain is that the Israelis were able to intercept and how. But I just want you to imagine what we would say if, let's just pick China or Iran. Let's pick China or Iran. One of the bad countries purposely knew that cell phones were coming to the United States. Let's say they knew they were coming to the U.S. military. The U.S. military was importing a bunch of devices, mobile devices, and the Chinese were able to intercept or collaborate with the manufacturer and put remote-controlled bombs inside each device, thousands of them. Which means they would not only be with generals and military officials, but with rank-and-file soldiers, but also just civilians who work near them, maybe their families, or anyone in their vicinity. If they're at a supermarket, which soldiers do go to, if they're at a shopping mall, they could injure and endanger anybody else around them. Obviously, what would we call that? We would call that terrorism. Nobody would actually be saying that that was some targeted attack. In fact, even when people do attack U.S. military installations and kill only American soldiers, we call that terrorism. There have been several during the War on Terror where people went and entered Marine bases and killed a dozen or so Marines, as well as other people who were there. That was called terrorism. The flying of a plane into the Pentagon, a classic legitimate military target, that was called terrorism. And obviously a lot of the October 7th attack, even though it was purposely distorted by trying to say, 1,400 Israelis were killed, itself involved a lot of targeting of military and police bases by Hamas. A lot of those people, not 1,400, it's been downgraded to almost 1,150, almost half of them, if not more, turned out to be active duty soldiers in the military, the Israeli military. Now, obviously, there were a lot of civilians killed in Israel, not just killed, but targeted purposely. There were Hamas fighters who committed war crimes by purposely targeting and killing civilians, but the ratio of legitimate military targets to civilians was better than 1-to-1, which is often the argument that Israel makes for why what they're doing in Gaza is justified, even though that ratio is a lie. Now, just to underscore how we can think about this, after 9/11, Noam Chomsky wrote a book that surprisingly became a bestseller, or maybe not surprisingly, since he was one of the very few people deviating from the narrative about why 9/11 happened, what it means, what our role of our foreign policy is. And he has been talking a long time about how terrorism is wielded, how freedom fighter is wielded, how resistance fighters are wielded. We called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan freedom fighters. They were invited by Ronald Reagan to the White House to be celebrated while they were fighting against Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And the minute they started fighting against American occupation, they instantly turned into terrorists. We took people from Afghanistan who were in Afghanistan, who were doing nothing more than defending their country and fighting against American forces occupying it, and brought them to Guantanamo and called them terrorists, even though they were targeting and fighting against not civilians, but American soldiers in their country. That's how manipulated and flexible and meaningless this term is, terrorism and the like. And he did a series of interviews with a lot of very adversarial people who were horrified by the things he was saying, and it gave him an opportunity to really lay out the premises of what he was saying. This was now 22 years ago. And I know Noam Chomsky has said a lot of controversial things since then. People in public life for 60 years, there's almost nobody who will. To try and set aside whatever you think he's done or said that was bad, that's unrelated to this topic, and just listen to what he was saying in the beginning of 2002, just a few months after the 9/11 attacks, when he, among very few people, were willing to say this, and the fact that he wrote a best-selling book made his platform among the largest.
But you seem to see this moral equivalence the whole
There's no
time between
moral-
bin Laden and Bush. don't you?
Moral equivalence is a term of propaganda that was invented to try to prevent us from looking at what the acts for which we are responsible.
You say there
I
are plenty
reject
of bin
that
Ladens on both sides.
Pardon?
You say there are plenty of bin Ladens,
Oh, there are bin Ladens all over the
on
world.
both sides.
There are
That's
plenty
a
of
moral
monsters.
equivalence.
No, it's
That's
not.
a polemic.
It's not moral equivalence. There is no such notion. There are many different dimensions and criteria. For example, there's no moral equivalence between the bombing of the World Trade Center and the destruction of Nicaragua or of El Salvador, of Guatemala. The latter were far worse by any criterion. So there's no moral equivalence. Furthermore, they were done for different reasons, and they were done in different ways. There's all sorts of dimensions.
But why, when the U.S. is considering what to do about this, do you always go back to past?
Not past,
crimes,
present.
See, well, you mentioned Nicaragua.
I mentioned that because it's uncontroversial, since there's a World Court and Security Council resolution. But I can take cases, since it's uncontroversial, it's a good example. I mentioned these cases.
Are you kicking the U.S. when it's down?
No, I'm asking that we accept the definition of hypocrite given in the Gospels. I think that's correct. The hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. I don't think we should be hypocrites.
To what aim do you do this? To what aim do you wish to point this out?
Because I think we should try to rise to the level of minimal moral integrity. Once we can rise to the level of minimal moral integrity, then we can discuss these issues seriously. If we can't even rise to that level, there's any point to talking. Minimal moral integrity requires that if we think something is wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it.
All right, so that is basically the premise of Chomsky's dissent from U.S. foreign policy for many decades. And if you just apply that to what happened today, you just imagine, as I said, China shipping in thousands of rigged phones with bombs that they then remotely detonate, regardless of where those phones are or who's carrying them. Or if Hezbollah or Iran did that inside Israel and killed and injured thousands of people, including civilians, and detonated those bombs in restaurants and shops, supermarkets, and street fairs, the way that Israel did today in the suburbs of Beirut, it's not very difficult to imagine exactly what everyone by consensus would call that. And the only thing different in these cases, in those actions, is who's doing it and against whom it's being perpetrated. And there's almost more of a reflexive instinct in the United States to defend anything and everything that Israel does as a noble act of terrorism or self-defense, almost more so than defending our own government itself. And I think that's a big part of why they want to implement a law banning a lot of different criticisms of Israel, including suggesting that there are Americans who seem to be more devoted to defending Israel than to their own government. Thanks for watching this clip from
All right. Hello, everyone. Let's get started. Let's get right to it. We got to talk about these explosions in Lebanon. More explosions. I'm sure you heard about the pagers that went off. Now it's spread. It's going to walkie-talkies, maybe other things. So if you didn't hear about it, well, several thousand small explosions, but very lethal because they happened on the sides of people. Here you see some guy. He's really severely wounded because he had a pager on his belt go off and rip into his sides there. And these are the little pagers down here. Let me get my tool out. Oh, wrong tool. You're going to like it better when I get the laser pointer. Yeah. So little pagers. Remember pagers? Well, they thought these were secure communications, and they started out looking like this, and then they ended up looking like these ripped fragments. They clearly had high explosives in them. And if we look at the amount of damage that we saw going on out here in these things here, we can see quite a bit of very intense damage going on. A lot of people wounded, thousands, several deaths, I think 9 or so. Some children were hurt. And it didn't stop there, of course. And this is the entire view of what's going on in just one hospital all across southern Lebanon, the country of Lebanon. People were injured by what's going on. And it looks like definitely high explosives is blowing out windows. This isn't like a battery caught fire. I'm sure you've all seen that. Yeah, you know what? Lithium batteries can be a little bit energetic. Maybe they contributed certainly to maybe the fire afterwards, but the explosions we saw off of these were clearly highly energetic, not like a battery sort of catching fire and maybe going a little poof or even a pop. These were explosions. So I'm not sure how that happened. What a security failure for the Hezbollah operatives, and what an intense operation this must have been. But it changes a lot of things, not for the better, and we're going to talk about that. First, let's go to the idea that now walkie-talkies are starting to detonate across Lebanon. That's the report we have. We're going to have to get that confirmed, but I do see pictures like this one down here in the lower right of this set here. That's a walkie-talkie, clearly energetically blown up, and we see a car on fire. We see apartment fires. Obviously, there's lots and lots of fires and things going on all over the place. We see them as well. Here's a different apartment fire. I'm not sure if that's the same car we saw before, but we're being reported here that 24 hours after over 4,000 pagers exploded. 4,000, what an operation. Killing 12, injuring over 3,000. Well, I can't guarantee they were all Hezbollah terrorists. One man's terrorist, another man's fighter. Hard to say. Fresh explosions are now taking place in handheld walkie-talkies, VHF sets, also used by Hezbollah. And here's an example of one of those explosions. Notice here again, you're going to see this ripping of the metal here, this ripping and the peeling of it. There's not a chance in the world that's what happens when a lithium battery just sort of catches fire. So this isn't overclocking, overheating the batteries. This is something else. And on the heels of that, just today, this is something we're going to be talking about with my subscribers back at Peak Prosperity. So if you are a Peak Prosperity subscriber, come on by. This is deadly serious. We got to talk about what just happened. I think World War III, unfortunately, has officially begun. And I think it's connected to the Lebanon misadventure over here. I'm going to call it a misadventure. Adam Oni here, one star on Twitter, exemplifying, not to just pick on one person, but exemplifying what I think is very simplistic first level, first order thinking, says about the pager explosions, quote, "This seems like a very effective way to target terrorists and limit civilian casualties. Seems that there will be less collateral damage than a cruise missile or a drone strike," end quote. Now, the problem I have with this point of view is that this changes everything. It just, now imagine what happens that this attack vector has been opened up. Think about the impact on your life. Sure, it looks clever, and they temporarily put a small dent in what they're calling terrorists. Given our dependence on electronics, this is a very bad precedent. Here's why. Edward Snowden said if it were iPhones that were leaving the factory with explosives inside, the media would be a hell of a lot faster to cotton on to what a horrific precedent has been set today. Nothing can justify this. It's a crime, and everyone in the world is less safe for it. Now, what is he talking about? He's talking about this. He's talking about, remember the underwear bomber? Maybe you don't. Omar Farouk Abdulmutallab. This is some guy, really low IQ, lots of questions about how he actually manufactured a complicated set of underwear with two separate types of explosives in there. And he was supposed to, remember, inject some liquid from a syringe, and it was going to cause the whole thing to blow up. So he was going to set off his own underwear bomb. I'm not sure the guy even understood what he was wearing, and it's very unclear how he even got his passport. Point being, good chance there was state level, let's just say, help that he got. I don't believe this gentleman manufactured his own underwear bomb. Doesn't matter how it happened necessarily, because what I want to talk about is that's how it started, and now everybody in the world has to do this to go in to get on a flight. So it started with an underwear bomb, and next thing you know, you're getting scanned and groped at TSA lines all over the world, in the United States, TSA, but security elsewhere. So this is why this is such a terrible precedent. Now consider Matt Wallace reporting here that, and again, unconfirmed early stage reports. This is just, we're going to have to see what actually the truth is, but it's being reported home solar energy systems are now exploding in Beirut, Lebanon. Most intelligence agencies have known how to do this for years, but intentionally avoided it because the extreme global ramifications of opening the door to such horror. This is industrial sabotage, but it could strike even all the way down to the individual. Does this mean that anything with a lithium battery now, if whether it's a home solar system, a pager, a walkie-talkie, a cell phone, a car, think of the ramifications of this. So yeah, those people like, oh, this is so cool. What a cool way to get at terrorists. Fine, you can think that, but you didn't think through all the impacts this has on the world. This is a horrible precedent has been set. Whoever authorized this and thought this was a good idea is actually sponsoring state level terror as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So at any rate, advice here is turn off the notifications, turn the notifications on quickly. This guy's going to post a list of all the devices you potentially have to worry about. Don't panic, but be aware it's not out of the question. We could see mass boom hacks of entire countries in the West soon. So what comes around goes around is the point of that. And a terrible, terrible precedent has been set. First, we can't trust our devices anymore. Really? I'm going to have to worry that some rogue person, because I sent out a mean tweet or used the wrong phrase, forgot a pronoun, is going to set off my device, teach me a lesson, catch my house on fire in the middle of the night. This is awful, terrible, terrible, because we need fourth turnings are marked by a profound loss of trust and faith in institutions. What could be more profound than this? Terrible, terrible precedent has been set. All travel guarantees going to become more difficult for the little people. I'm sure if you out there, all those of you who fly private jets, don't worry. You get to just walk right on and carry on with your lives. But everybody else, oh, now there's going to be a special device screening line thing, and devices are going to have to be pre-screened, and this is going to be awful. Or they're just not going to allow you to travel with your devices anymore. The risk is too high. Can't have these things going off mid-flight. And I agree. You can't. You can't. If it turns out this is some sort of a zero-day hack, well, and you can't get around it and there's no way to protect it, guess what's going to happen? They're going to say all devices manufactured before this new date, when we started remanufacturing them in a way where this hack had been sort of rinsed out of the system, all those prior devices are going to have to be thrown away. This is going to cost you money, and it's going to be a big pain in the butt. And no, it wasn't worth it. Clever as it was, looks good in a movie. What an amazing plot line. But this was a really stupid thing to unleash on the world. And why now, we have to ask. Okay. Retaliation is going to ensue. So it looks clever, but get ready. People are going to be mad about this. And guess what? More mad people in the region of the Middle East could easily lead to tempers flaring even more than they already have. And by the way, if the Middle East fires up, you can kiss the economy and a huge number of jobs goodbye, maybe your own. I don't know. It depends what industry you're in. The Western economies are all tilting around, wobbling a bit on huge amounts of debt that requires cheap oil to finance. And if the Middle East fires up, there's a good chance oil becomes exceedingly expensive. That shock to the system will be very, very bad. But we might not have to wait for the Middle East to fire up, because we got this other thing going on we got to talk about. There was just an attack this morning, but this will have to be reserved for Peak Prosperity subscribers. We got to go over to that because, well,
President Zelensky were intimating that President Zelensky's request for permission to use British offensive weaponry, long-range missiles to reach deep into Russia would be granted. After that, and perhaps while Prime Minister Starmer was flying to the United States, President Putin said, don't even think about it, because that will mean the West, NATO, Great Britain, and the United States are at war with Russia, and we will respond accordingly. There never was an announcement about the use of the long-range missiles. In fact, the White House specifically said on Friday morning, late last week, that there would be no such announcement on Friday. To date, no announcement has come. What do you think happened? Do you think the Defense Department said to the president, don't be out of your mind, we're not ready for this? Do you think people listened to what Vladimir Putin said and thought,
oh, I think they
agree?
very definitely listened to President Putin. There's no question about it. He made it unambiguously clear that if targets inside Russia were now struck with whatever long-range strike weapons we give the Ukrainians, that would essentially be a war with Russia, between Russia and NATO, and of course, between Russia and the United States. My impression is that this administration would like to keep this, what I would call diminishing phony war going, because it is phony. Right now, you've got over 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, untold damage to the power grid. The hospitals are overflowing. The place is a catastrophe. But we want to keep this going through the election. But beyond that, I think people right now in Washington are genuinely afraid. And I think they've told the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6 to back off because they're really running the war.
How serious was the threat? Not how serious was it perceived, but how serious was it in reality? What do you think President Putin would have done? Would he have considered striking the American mainland?
Yes, I think he would, but I don't think he would have done it initially. I think the first wave of attacks would have been hypersonic missiles launched against targets in Europe that are NATO and U.S. targets, everything from Ramstein Air Base to Grafenwehr to any number of supply depots, railheads, and other aerodromes where aircraft can be assembled for use against Russia. So I think that's what you would have seen, not nuclear weapons initially, but hypersonic missiles. And of course, we can't shoot them down. They're coming in at roughly 5,000 miles per hour or more. So there's no defense against them.
Colonel, you were once an official in the Defense Department. Do you think that officials in the Defense Department actually went to the White House and said, stop listening to intel? We can't deal with this. Putin is serious.
It's possible, but I have no way of knowing. And, thus far, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, has been a go along, get along guy. He really hasn't raised strenuous objections to very much, but it's possible. I certainly know that senior officers in the Air Force and the Army, I know absolutely have raised questions about the wisdom of this, and have probably pointed out what you just said, that we have no defense against these hypersonic missiles.
Colonel, yesterday, Ukrainian drones, or this may actually have happened early today, European time, destroyed a Russian missile warehouse in a place called Toropets, Toropets, Russia, destroying 300 Iskander missiles and other anti-aircraft munitions. The explosion was so enormous, it was detected on seismograph meters in the area. What does this tell you? Does it tell you that the crushing defeat the Ukrainians suffered in Kursk was not enough to teach them to stay out of Russia? Or do they really think they're going to accomplish something by an offensive attack like this?
Judge, I think we have to understand that this is a war that is largely being conducted today by the CIA and MI6 in London. Now, they've had NATO senior officers give them extraordinarily bad advice, starting with the man at the top all the way down to the 2-star and 1-star levels in the U.S. Army. So there's no question about that. But the war at this point is really in the hands of the CIA. I don't think the Ukrainians per se are doing very much except dying in great numbers. And remember, this is more evidence for what President Putin mentioned when he spoke publicly about what would happen if we struck targets deep inside Russia. He said, we know that without United States intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in space, without the communications capabilities, without trained technicians on the ground, intelligence and uniformed military personnel, the Ukrainians couldn't do very much. He knows that. So this is just another nail in the coffin of our relationship, not just with Russia, but I think with everybody in Europe. We're making things worse at a point in time where, in the interest of the Ukrainian people, this should be scaled back dramatically, and we should be concerned about humanitarian aid for Ukraine, not more weaponry. But the CIA is operating this almost in isolation from any strict guidance. So I hope seriously that Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Blinken, President Biden, and others have made it emphatically clear that we will not tolerate the use of these strike weapons against targets inside Russia, because if it continues, we will be treated to a hail of those hypersonic missiles, and they'll come quickly, suddenly, and dramatically.
And they can't be shot down.
No. It's over 5,000 miles per hour. The fastest speed at Mach speed is at about 7,600 miles per hour. We rarely see that. But right now, from 4,500 up to about 6,000 miles per hour, those missiles are untouchable. By the time you have acquired it, it's vanished. You saw the Houthis who fired a missile 1,300 miles, and it reached its target inside of 12 minutes. I mean, that's astonishingly fast. Yeah, we just can't keep up with it. We can't track it because your radars have to operate at light speed to stay ahead of the missile that you've detected. So right now, no, we can't shoot them down.
Is Ukraine on the verge of collapse? Is it limping? I'll use this phrase, limping toward election day.
Oh, I think the place is on life support. It's worse than that. This is a comatose patient, very nearly, and the doctors are now trying to breathe for the patient. That's essentially what we're trying to say. Nothing would be happening if it were not for our intelligence networks, our technicians, intelligence officers, and military advisors on the ground. This would have long since ended. So we've got the whole place on life support.
Colonel, here's somebody who disagrees with you. I'm sure the audience is 100% on your side, and you are welcome to brush his hair. Cut number 7.
As for the role the Ukrainians could themselves play in stability and security in the Euro-Atlantic area, it's obvious. This is thanks to the heroism of the Ukrainian forces. They've been fighting for more than 2 years, almost 3 years. They are the most accomplished armed forces in the whole continent, and it's easy to see how they could play a very, very important role in peace and stability on the European continent. One of the arguments I think we should make to our American friends is if they want to take back some US troops from the European theater and save a few billion, a lot of billion, Mike, then I'm sure the Ukrainians, having defeated the Russians, and there's nobody more effective at defeating the Russians than the Ukrainians, I'm sure the Ukrainians would be only too happy to backfill in Europe. Anyway, those are some of the things, some of the ways in which I think Ukraine can be a force for stability.
Mike, to whom he refers, is seated next to him, former CIA director and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Delusional?
Well, let's put it this way. I think that Boris Johnson is by far the most accomplished clown in the NATO circus. There's nobody who is capable of more outrageous statements and behavior than Johnson. There's a funny sidebar to this whole thing. If you notice his hair, sadly, that's very common in Great Britain. And we used to see British officers when I was at Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe would show up for group photos. And you'd have all these British officers mixed in with the rest of us. And I remember the photographer, who I think was actually a Belgian, and he said, "Can you please ask the Englishman with the fuzzy hair to move a little to the right?" And then everybody looked at him and he said, "Which one?" Everybody looks like Boris Johnson in uniform. It's really bizarre. No, this is absurd nonsense. The man is completely outrageous. He's reading from a script. He doesn't know anything, doesn't know what he's talking about, and he doesn't care. And unfortunately, I think Pompeo falls into the same club. These people are shameless warmongers. It pays them. It rewards them. The people that want war pay them very well. That's the catastrophe we're dealing with right now.
Let's not forget the role that Boris Johnson played in this war, perhaps more significant than anybody else in the West, being the American emissary to Zelensky, saying, don't sign that agreement that's been negotiated in Istanbul, because we and the Americans have your backs. We'll give you what you need, and we'll take out the Putin government with you.
Well, if there was a shred of humanity in Zelensky, and he cared at all about the people of Ukraine, he would have long since thrown us overboard and declared an immediate ceasefire, because his country, his countrymen are being destroyed. His nation is being destroyed. I don't know that there will be much of Ukraine left when this is over. Everybody seems to think that millions upon millions of Ukrainians will return home from abroad. I don't think so.
Colonel,
this is a catastrophe.
Is the number of dead soldiers, Ukrainian dead soldiers, up to 600,000? That's a whole generation.
Yes, absolutely. These are numbers that we haven't seen since the First World War. And that's the kind of battlefield damage that's been inflicted on Ukraine. And you've got one side that has perfected the system of linking strike forces, rocket artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, conventional artillery, to overhead surveillance and drones. And the other side doesn't have that capability. The other side is effectively blinded in most cases at any given point in time and depends entirely on our space-based surveillance. So they've been slaughtered in great numbers.
What
and again,
happened?
Who would let this happen? Who is a head of state? It's incomprehensible.
What has become of their invasion and occupation of 500 square miles in Kursk?
Well, first of all, there was never any occupation of 400 or 500 square miles or kilometers or anything else. These areas are densely forested and largely devoid of population. Most of the Russians who lived in those villages have been pulled out, and what's left is being slaughtered. I mean, at least 200-300 tanks, hundreds of armored fighting vehicles. In fact, the Pentagon, I'm told, has now been asked to order another 200 Bradleys, armored fighting vehicles, for potential delivery to Ukraine. 200 more. I mean, this is an unending catastrophe. We're just pouring more and more money, resources, and equipment and blood into a bottomless pit, all to prevent people like Biden and others in Washington, Lindsey Graham and the rest, from standing up and admitting we were wrong. We made a terrible mistake. We've destroyed Ukraine, and we've now helped to make Russia into the most powerful military state probably in the world, certainly as far as its army is concerned and its rocketry and missiles.
Transitioning to Israel, Colonel, yesterday the Israelis caused about 3,300 or so pagers to explode in the pocketbooks nearby Hezbollah people and people in Lebanon and in Syria. About 2,700 have been injured. About 12,000 about 12 are dead, including 2 children. This morning, there were about another 200 of these exploding in a different part of Lebanon. Is this the beginning of a major regional confrontation between Lebanon and its allies and Israel?
I think so. The Israelis have said that the reason they initiated this cyber attack, probably one of the largest in history, was because the Arabs were beginning to catch on. In other words, people in Hezbollah and in Lebanon and probably the Iranians had begun to figure out, or at least detect, that something like this could happen. And so they felt that they had to initiate it quickly in order to derive some benefit from it. I think that was an unfortunate decision, because this attack will not now necessarily benefit from what just happened. Nobody who was killed is indispensable. Charles de Gaulle used to say the cemeteries are full of indispensable people, and he was right. But this is a setback. But on the other hand, This is a capability that's been with us for some time. People need to understand this. I mean, it's not difficult to cause these lithium batteries to explode. There are ways to do it. We have a case, at least in 1989, of a Palestinian Arab who was identified as having something to do with a bombing in Israel. And he picked up his phone in 1989, and the phone exploded, almost blew his head off. So this has been with us for a while. The problem with these kinds of capabilities is that once you use them, it's over. You know, you've gotten about all you're going to get out of it. In other words, there's no surprise left. There's no real benefit. And once you use it, everybody knows about it. So you have to be very judicious when employing these kinds of things. We have a lot of programs in the United States and in NATO that can do these kinds of things, but you've got to be careful when and how you use them.
What did the Israelis gain from what they did yesterday? Gain for them?
Well, I think they thought that they were going to.
Revolutionary salute to Tito Moon. As you say, what's up, bro? I love the ESG interview. Good work. I appreciate the donation, family. Appreciate you watching the interview. Revolution is real life. Appreciate the love, family. Salute.
Going to do a lot of damage to Hezbollah and its fighters and some of its leaders, and they probably have done some of that. I think they've also made new enemies. People that were not terribly interested in them in the past are now resolute enemies forever. This is the danger, because from the standpoint of the people that pick up the phone or have the pager in their pocket and the damn thing explodes, this is a terrorist attack. This is not seen as part of warfare as we understand it. So from the vantage point of people on the ground in Lebanon that are suffering, this was another quote unquote Israeli terrorist act.
Colonel General Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM, visited the Israeli defense minister and Prime Minister Netanyahu twice last week. What does that tell you? Is it we got your back no matter what happens in Lebanon, or is it we don't have your back if you're going to move into Lebanon?
I think the issue right now is not whether or not we're going to support them. We've made it very clear that if they go into Lebanon and this war widens, that we will support them. So I don't think there's much question there. The problem is, how long can we keep all the ships at sea? You know, people seem to think that aircraft carrier battle groups are self-contained entities that can sail around for months at a time. That's not true. They have to be routinely provisioned with food, fuel, repair parts, everything that you can imagine. And I think the timing is very, very acute right now. And I think we're going to see this offensive into Lebanon start fairly quickly now, because we're telling Mr. Netanyahu, we can't sit around waiting for you to do something. So if you're going to do something, you'd better do it quickly, because we can't be out here much longer. So I think that's really the rub. The other thing is that we're worried about resupply, about the numbers of missiles that we have and replenishing those. And remember, we have lost a lot of materiel and missiles and equipment in Ukraine that we cannot easily replenish right now. So I think all of those matters are playing into the discussion. But no, we're going to support the Israelis. There's no question about that.
Colonel, between Ukraine and Israel, how low are America's military supplies?
Well, you know, Judge, I'd have to speculate, but I think they're probably dangerously low, given the destruction that we've witnessed. And I'm not sure that they were ever that high. You've got to understand that when, for instance, Desert Storm occurred back in 1990-91, we were sitting on mountains of munitions and equipment. Those mountains have largely gone away. We've either disposed of them because they were obsolete, or we've used them up in Ukraine in particular. So I don't think we have the limitless stocks that we once did. In fact, I think they're very low. And again, you're now pushing the Russians and potentially others into a position where they may feel they have to intervene to protect themselves. In other words, at some point, if you push hard enough, you get what you've seen in eastern Ukraine. Everybody knows this was not an unprovoked assault by Putin. He went in there as a matter of self-defense for Russia and to protect the Russians that were on the ground in eastern Ukraine. he discovered that what he thought was bad was infinitely worse than he anticipated.
That's a
And
fact.
so he's had to go through a massive military mobilization and buildup. Now he has a tremendous capability that he did not have in February of 2022. But we don't. We don't have that. We have no surge capability. If the president of the United States directed the Secretary of Defense, produce 2,000 missiles, 2,000 ATACMS, 2,000 Patriot missiles, 3,000 strike systems, SM-3, whatever it is, we can't do it very quickly. We don't have that ability.
Going back to Israel, the Israeli government leaked the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu is contemplating firing Defense Minister Gallant and replacing him with another right-wing oriented person like Smotrich or Gavir, not Smotrich or Ben Gavir, but someone like that. Do we care? Is it going to make any difference? At the same time, this retired Major General Gadi Shamni says our soldiers are winning every tactical encounter with Hamas, but we're losing the war, and in a big way. This is a recently retired IDF Major General. What's your take on all of this, Colonel?
Well, I think in broad terms, the general is right. But I think it's a mistake to assume that every encounter is a win for the Israelis. It's not. And remember that they have very few people that they can afford to lose at any given point in time. The last time they went to war and suffered casualties on the scale that they're suffering or have been suffering to date was in 1973. They had 2,000 dead at that point, and that was a severe setback to Israel. It only has a limited manpower pool based on the 6.2 million Jews that live there. And now we've had this issue of forcing portions of the Jewish population that don't want to fight as part of the IDF. So I think he's essentially correct. I don't think Gallant's departure will help Netanyahu. I also am not sure that it's going to make much difference to him. He's really in charge. And unless you remove him, I don't see much changing. And even then, the Israelis are in a tough position. They've essentially said that whatever happens, they can never accept a Palestinian state. And I think they all know that if they back away from their original goals, which is to essentially eliminate the Arab populations in the West Bank and Gaza, that's really where they want to go, and now in southern Lebanon, that they're going to have to accept something else. So I think the Israeli government, the Israeli people, the Israeli Defense Force, everyone is in the same boat. It's either we win or we go down with the ship, which is a terrible position to be in. And no one in Washington seems to be interested in helping them out. I mean, we think we're helping them by giving them anything they want. In fact, we put them on a road to suicide, in my judgment.
Foreign Minister Gallant appears to have become, Defense Minister Gallant, the one that Prime Minister Netanyahu was contemplating replacing, seems to have become the voice of the IDF to the Prime Minister. We're exhausted. We're not winning. We're not ready to go into Lebanon. Are they ready to go into Lebanon as a fighting force?
Well, without the hard data, in other words, to look at the equipment sets and the numbers of people who've been killed and wounded as a result of the war in Gaza and whatever else has happened in terms of the Hezbollah strikes, I can't be absolutely certain, but I think I can say that this has lasted longer than any other conflict in which Israel has been engaged. Their economy is very definitely in ruins. They are subsisting on billions of dollars of American money to stay afloat and money from the diaspora, wealthy Jews overseas. So we know that. And then if you look at the numbers of people that they can mobilize and have in the IDF, a substantial number of these people have been wounded or killed. So I would say they probably aren't ready for what Hezbollah has to offer. But, I don't have the hard data. No one does. I mean, they're not going to volunteer the hard data to us.
Colonel, 2 nights ago on MSNBC, the former United States Senator, former Secretary of State, former Democratic candidate for president, and graduate of Yale Law School, Hillary Rodham Clinton, told Rachel Maddow that it was acceptable for the Justice Department to prosecute Americans who, quote, traffic in propaganda. I guess that's Orwellian for speak a language and utter ideas that the government doesn't want to hear. Is the freedom of speech under attack when Mrs. Clinton can say something like that with a serious face?
Revolutionary Stew to our brothers, Vincent Brown Scott, for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. I absolutely appreciate the love, brother. Salute to you.
Oh, indisputably. Remember that the people that we're dealing with right now on the left, people like Hillary Clinton and her colleagues, the closest analog that I can come to them involve people like Trotsky and Lenin, Kamenev, Radek, these Bolsheviks who reached the conclusion early on that they had a monopoly on truth, that theirs was not simply the right way, it was the only way. And that's very much the mentality of the hard left. And so anyone who stands up and contradicts anything that they consider to be truth, objective truth, remember that's what the old Soviets, the old Communist Party of the Soviet Union used to talk about, objective truth, then they're the enemy. And this is not new, Judge. This has been going on for a long time, and shutting down anyone who doesn't agree with you is ultimately the goal. And so, yes, free speech is very much under attack. There's no question.
I mean, the federal government just obtained indictments against Russians for being in Russia, working for a Russian network and articulating views on that network. It's inconceivable to me how those human beings violated American law. But they're Russian and American citizens, and they own real estate in Virginia.
Yeah, well, look, the law doesn't mean a great deal to these people. They're only interested in power and gaining power, retaining power, never giving it up. They're very unhappy with the way things are going right now, and are desperate to cling to power long past November. So they will opt for any device at their disposal to stay there. And they're convinced that they're right and everyone else is wrong. They're the ones who've opened our borders and allowed millions and millions of people we know nothing about to enter our country. These are the same people who are releasing criminals onto the streets, which incidentally is something the Bolsheviks did when they took power. In fact, they not only released criminals, but organized them to help them kill their enemies. So this is not new. This is sick. It's deranged. Every American should be very concerned about this and up in arms about it. It's not just free speech. Free speech is, a keystone in the edifice of our rights, the Bill of Rights. We all know that. It's more than that. It's the destruction of our republic. It's the ruin of our country. And so we have to stand up against this. I hope that we will.
Colonel, what have you been up to lately, besides your many appearances here and on other venues that mainstream media doesn't want to hear about?
Well, that's quite a question, Judge.
Well, you and I met at Fox when we were both welcome there. Neither of us is welcome there any longer.
No, you don't want to go in the green room there anymore. You may never come out. There'll be somebody cuffing you and carting you off, I guess. Look, we at Our Country, Our Choice have
Well, we now know there are so many assassination attempts against President Trump. According to a deep state leak that the iNews out of the UK is reporting, they got their hands on the Secret Service admitting that it can't protect Trump from being assassinated. Can't make this up, because of course they can. They're just choosing not to. And they're trying to blame it on, well, there's a lot of guns and there's a lot of social media rhetoric.
They don't want it.
Why do they exist then?
Yeah, their whole purpose is to protect the president.
But they can't do
former
it.
president, but they can't do it because there's a lot of guns. Buying guns is. We'll get to what their excuses are in here. So go ahead.
Protected from what then? Bees? Like they didn't know that guns existed. They're like, wait. People are going to be shooting at us.
Well, let's say also shrubbery and slanted roofs seem to be their kryptonite.
Apparently, guns are a new thing.
Yeah.
Maybe John Wilkes Booth. I don't know, what did he use back in 1860? 1865.
Rocks. They can protect against rocks.
We've known about guns for a long time. We've known about lone actors. We've known about conspiracies for a long time. Groups of individuals getting together to kill the president of the United States.
I guess after
Ford's
Kennedy,
Theater.
they should have just said, well, this is a thing.
Yeah, I guess these guns are a thing. 100 years after Lincoln, we have JFK. Anyway, so according to I know, you can't even make this up. I'm just furious just going over this. I'm just like, they're basically telegraphing, we can't stop it. It's going to happen. Trump's going to be assassinated. That's basically what they're saying. Here it is. The U.S. Secret Service cannot guarantee it can prevent further shootings, such as the 2 apparent assassination attempts involving Donald Trump. U.S. and British intelligence sources have told iNews. Law enforcement sources on both sides of the Atlantic warned that aggressive social media rhetoric and the ease of buying firearms has created a threat for both presidential campaigns too large for the U.S. agency to deal with alone. On Sunday, Mr. Trump faced his second assassination attempt in 2 months as a would-be shooter positioned himself in the bushes on the perimeter of his Florida golf club. A Secret Service agent monitoring one hole ahead of Mr. Trump spotted the barrel of a gun pointing through the fence line. One suspect was later arrested about 40 miles from the scene, and an official investigation has been launched by the FBI. U.S. intelligence source told iNews that social media rhetoric that encourages violence with no end in sight has seen a rise in individuals spurred on to launch attacks against political figures they disagree with. The rise of individual actors who are not affiliated with any specific traditional ideology or organization continues to be the main threat pattern. They warned about the rise in aggression fueled by social media. And the U.S. Secret Service is not resourced to track every, quote, crazy narrative on the internet, end quote, requiring them to lean on other agencies. Really? So wait a second. Let's just so we understand here, this shooter the other day at Trump's golf course was not some just random poster on the internet. We now know, according to Breitbart, that the FBI, Interpol, the Customs and Border Protection were warned about the Trump assassination suspect Ryan Routh multiple times. This was not just some random internet social media narrative BS.
Also, didn't we cover last week the fact that they have a mass surveillance tool and they're going to survey us? Refer to the piece I did about how the Department of Homeland Security now has this weapon of mass surveillance that they say can protect against any fake news, any AI simulation. They're on it. They say they can control the whole internet unless it's a threat to Trump.
Well, unless it's a threat to Trump, we'll allow that to happen.
I mean, they did know about him. So the surveillance is working okay. It's just the act upon it thing that seems to be a bit wonky at the moment.
Maybe
they
what
know
they need
about
to do. Let's have them just go scrub all the BlackRock commercials, and everybody that's in them just go. Go
keep an extra eye on them.
These guys keep showing up in BlackRock commercials. Yeah, and now there's speculation. In fact, we don't know if it's confirmed yet that this Ryan Routh was actually at a Kamala Harris rally. He was caught on camera. He was one of the individuals who was bussed into the rally. Because people aren't actually showing up to her rallies. They have to be bussed in and paid for, like paid for actors. Be interesting to see if the Kamala Harris campaign actually paid this guy. Maybe we'll get there. But anyway, we're learning now that authorities ignored multiple warnings about the Trump assassination suspect, Ryan Routh. He had been flagged to the FBI, Interpol, Customs and Border Protection months before this incident. Months. Chelsea Walsh, a nurse who had interactions with Routh in Ukraine, repeatedly alerted authorities about his violent behavior and potential recruitment of Syrian refugees. But no significant actions were taken. Quoting now from Breitbart. When she heard in 2023 that Routh was attempting to recruit Syrian refugees to fight in Ukraine, she filed an online report with the FBI and Interpol outlining her concerns about Routh and others. Neither Customs nor FBI followed up with her. The FBI didn't immediately respond to a request for comment. Routh's behavior has been flagged to the FBI in the past, though not in connection to Ukraine. A tipster told the FBI in 2019 that Routh had a firearm despite being a felon, but when questioned further, wouldn't verify providing the information. an FBI official said on Monday. The Bureau passed the information on to authorities in Honolulu, Hawaii, where Routh was living at the time, and they closed the investigation. After being alerted to these messages in early June, other aid groups banned him from their signal groups and reported his activities to the State Department, noting their concerns he might be engaging in human trafficking or immigration fraud. Beware of American Ryan Routh, Adams warned Ukraine aid groups in June 2023, or June 2nd, 2023. And this morning, at a Trump rally on Long Island, a bomb scare. Now, this is some video of that incident. Police were investigating a bomb inside a nearby vehicle at a Trump rally. But after police responded to this, Nassau police said, no, don't worry about it. This was just a suspicious incident. The Public Information Office reports a suspicious incident that occurred in Uniondale. Reports of explosives being found at the site are unfounded. There's a person who's being questioned who may have been training a bomb detection dog near the site. The individual with the bomb dog falsely reported explosives being found, and that individual is currently being detained by police. Okay, what?
Like a civilian training a bomb dog?
Right? Wait, what?
Then he reported himself?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot make this shit up. What in the world? So DC Drano posted this. Rogan Hanley said, guys, read this. The Nassau bomb threat situation smells fishy. Why would they be questioning the individual who planted bomb devices to, quote, help train the dog? Wouldn't they know who was doing the bomb detection? Seems like a strange time to do dog training, right?
Wait,
right next to a Trump
in
rally.
That training, do you call the police when you find it? If you put it there?
You put it there next to a Trump rally. Okay. And by the way, you train a bomb detection dog with actual live materials, right? With actual bomb making materials.
Yeah.
That's how you train a dog.
Okay. That's weird, right? That's
It's very weird. And as a journalist, Darren Beatty, of course, Darren Beatty is one of the really blew the story wide open on the pipe bomber situation after the DNC on January 6th. He's an excellent journalist. He writes this: if you look historically into historically suspicious events, you'll see a pattern in which there is some kind of training exercise or drill whose subject matter almost exactly overlaps with the real life thing that allegedly happens. This allows for plausible deniability when feds are caught. It was just confusion from the exercise. I'm not saying that this is what happened here, he says, but it is interesting to point out this pattern. And we just spent a whole week covering the 9/11 attacks. You can watch our full reports. We did a whole week-long look, interview after interview after interview on the propaganda surrounding 9/11. Sound familiar? Training exercises about twin towers and buildings being hit by airliners. Training exercises right as they're happening. Really interesting and suspicious. The same thing is said about the January 6th pipe bomb. The pipe bomb left by DNC headquarters. Training exercises, very interesting. Tony Saruja tweeted this earlier. He's a data analyst who tracks all of these things. He says, my team is helping with GPS data for 3 suspicious incidents near the Trump New York rally on Long Island during the sweeps. I will not be posting details publicly for now in order to protect the integrity of any ongoing investigations. If you are there and you see something, say something. 3 suspicious incidents near the Trump rally in Long Island. Yesterday, we interviewed ex-CIA agent Michael Scheuer. He got out in 2004. Now he's like on a mission to keep America out of these incidents in Ukraine and Israel and everything else, and pissing a lot of people off at the CIA. He said this yesterday on our show. This was yesterday, and then today we have a bomb scare at a Trump rally. Listen.
They may be finished, Clinton, with shooters, but not with a truck bomb or an aerial weapon of some kind. And they can blame it on anybody. They've got all the gangsters in the country they need, and they can set them up. The FBI specialty is setting up Muslim terrorists. They get one not very bright Muslim suggest an operation. He goes out and gets some dumber Muslims, and then at the last moment, the FBI picks him up and calls it a victory against terrorism. So there's lots of other options out there. And it depends on how many people they're willing to kill as to what option. Right now, they seem focused just on him. But if it's his family, if it's his children, if it's a bunch of people who just work for him, I think there's no hesitation on the part of the Democrats to preserve what they have to killing more than one person.
Sure, they kill lots of people in the Middle East.
Yeah.
They don't care about killing.
So there you have an ex-CIA agent saying that the deep state will stop at nothing. They're done with guns right now. They're moving on to explosives, and that they will. And now we're hearing from the Secret Service that we can't stop.
Well, we already see a man dead from the first attempted assassination. So that's now Trump supporters who are also, what do you call it?
Collateral damage.
Acceptable collateral damage.
And if you have a truck bomb or some sort of explosive that he's talking about, and then you hear, I mean, yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't care if they took out Trump supporters. They would love that. I'm sure they would absolutely love that. We are in dark.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, we are in dark and dangerous times right now, folks. And it's deeply troubling. Biden was sort of asked about this today as he's like leaving the White House, and he's just kind of mumbled some stuff about how Congress needs to do some stuff about Secret Service protection for the president. So right now, Department of Homeland Security under Mayorkas saying really only Secret Service protection for sitting presidents. So Kamala Harris, Vice President, President Biden, but minimal for President Trump, who has the largest rallies of any candidate right now. It's unbelievable.
Place the National Guard on the perimeter, the whole perimeter, just, National Guard or something. They'd do a better job probably of.
I'm sure Pelosi would
saying something.
Yeah.
Pelosi could bring in the National Guard. I'm sure she'd be first in line to do that like she did on January 6th. Cyber.
You to go up for Donald Trump. Just saying, just throwing it out there. A couple of things that we need to talk about before this goes any further. How about we start here? A couple of I want to talk about it and what I think, but first let's look at a couple of news stories that I think are related. Okay, let's start with this one. I think this is related. You may not. So somebody tries to put the move on Trump.
A little particular.
And what does Hillary Clinton say? Hillary Clinton says Trump poses a danger to our country and the world after the assassination attempt, which, might I add, if you're watching from YouTube, I'm sure Hillary was completely innocently making this comment. I'm not implying in any way, shape, or form that she could have maybe had any contact or influence with those who may have been attempting to perpetrate this heinous deed, right? So let's look at it this. Fox News. A day after a failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton said Monday that the former president posed a danger to our country and the world. And as I've said many times, one of the when I was a kid, I used to like to watch Transformers, right? And a lot of people, that was a real boy cartoon back before they turned them into girl cartoons, oddly enough, before all the superheroes became transgendered, superheroes or something. And back then they had like various superheroes, right? We had Wonder Woman, we had, Ultraman, whatever the hell, but now I guess, those things, they're not woke enough. But at any rate, I used to love Transformers, and they had an evil guy by the name of Megatron, and Megatron's second in command was named Starscream. Now, Megatron he was kind of like Hillary Clinton. He was never really nice to his second in command, and whenever something didn't go the way he wanted, which was pretty much every show, and those of you who have heard of ever watched the show will recall this a common phrase that was used by Megatron, and it went exactly like this again to his assistant Starscream. Starscream, you have failed me for the last time, right? It was always, you failed me for the last time this show, because you already knew the next show he was going to order Starscream to do something that would take away all of the Autobots, kill them all, destroy them, take their power cubes, whatever the hell. And Starscream was not going to be able to complete the task. And Megatron would say, "You failed me again, Starscream." Oh, no, rather, "You have failed me for the last time." I get the feeling that after the word went out, it was on the news, an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, that Hillary Clinton was somewhere going, attempt. Attempt? Did I hear them say attempt? She's grabbing Bill. You son of a bitch. Did they just say attempt? You know what I mean? She was pissed, right? And she picked up the phone and she called somebody at the CIA and she said, you have failed me for the last time. But, you know, they keep missing old Trumpy for some reason. So now think about this. I mean, let's just think about political etiquette here, right? Hillary, don't be so obvious, for God's sake. You can at least make it look like, look, usually when they take a swipe at Trump, you got to give Harris and Biden credit. Are they behind it? Yeah, well, you know, let's just say somebody's behind it. But you got to give them credit for playing the game, right? Hey, Joe Biden, did you hear that somebody tried to kill Trump? You know, of course, Biden just mumbled, nine. You know what I mean? He just mumbles and bumbles. He don't know. And they're like, yeah, good, great, good way to go there, Joe. Hey, Kamala, did you hear that? Somebody tried to kill Trump. And Kamala goes, oh my, what a terrible and unfortunate thing. I'll have to call poor Donald Trump and see if he's okay and make sure he's all right. I feel really unfortunate. Somebody tried to kill him, huh? Oh boy. No comment. Okay, bye. See you later. Right? They at least play it off. Hillary does not have, you know, I mean, that kind of etiquette. Let's face it. It's not something that's strange to Hillary. You know what I mean? I mean, people who cross Hillary, as they say about snitches, get stitches and end up in ditches, right? So Hillary, a day after, when the rest of DC is playing the game, the rest of the DC, the people who know the game were like, oh man, oh, poor old Trumpy there. You better give him a little boy Secret Service. What a terrible thing. You know, my prayers are with you. You know what I mean? You have my thoughts and prayers, that kind of crap, right? And then, of course, behind the scenes, they're like, darn, foiled again, right? Hillary doesn't have that kind of etiquette. Hillary's just like, a day after a failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton said Monday that the former president posed a danger to our country. Imagine that. They try to kill Trump. What do you think, Hillary? Damn it. He's a danger to our country. Why is this man still alive? She's looking around at like her assistant. Can somebody in this room, please, anyone answer you? Why is this man still alive? I thought I said last week that you were supposed to enter with the ump Ixnay with the ump tray, right? Remember that? Why is he still alive? Can I get you to, can anybody do their job around here? That's what Hillary's saying, you know, because she doesn't, you know, have that kind of, anyway. So here's what Hillary says. The press is still not able to cover Trump the way that they should. In other words, she doesn't mean the press. She means the CIA is not allowed to cover Trump the way they should. Clinton told MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, they careen from one outrage to the next. I don't understand why it's so difficult. Let me finish that sentence for you. To kill one little person. But actually what she said was why it's so difficult for the press to have a consistent narrative about how dangerous Trump is. You know, the late great journalist Harry Evans one time said that journalists should, you know, really try to achieve objectivity. And by that he said, I mean, they should cover the object. And when she says cover the object, back when I was in law enforcement, when we taught at the well, look, for instance, I'd at the range and I would give commands. I'd say, okay, when I blow the whistle, you're going to fire 3 and you're going to cover the target and then you're going to fire 3 more, right? That's what she meant when she said cover the object. She meant that in the same way that I meant when I was at the shooting range. Cover the target, or she called it the object. Why is it that we give the guy an AK-47 loaded with rounds? We tell him where Trump's going to be. We get him all straight. We okay, you know, MK Ultra. We give him and what do you do? The hell? He can't cover the object, right? Well, the object, and she says, well, the object in this case, target, is Donald Trump. His demagoguery, his danger to our country and the world, and stick with it, right? So bottom line is this. I think it's pretty clear at this point where Hillary was going. She was not a happy camper. A day after an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton was angry because it was an attempt. It's pretty clear where Hillary's coming from. Somebody was supposed to do their job. Somebody didn't accomplish the task that they were assigned. And now she's not happy about it and she lets it know. Now, why? Why might you ask? Why would somebody want to do a bad thing to Donald Trump. Here's something you might not have known. So let's cover this another second story before we get into this thing. It's a very important article, really, and you might not have seen it. It came out today, and let's talk about it. Very important article. Listen, look at this. Look who wrote it. Opinion by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. So it's RFK Jr. and Donald Trump's son, and it was in The Hill. Opinion: negotiate with Moscow to end the Ukraine war and prevent nuclear devastation, right? Let me tell you something. It's a pretty damn good article. I think RFK Jr. wrote it, but it's a pretty damn good article. And here's what I would say. The fact that RFK Jr., who is in fact a surrogate for Trump now, and Donald Trump's son put their name on it makes it pretty clear that this is Donald Trump's political position. Very clear, Donald. He's a surrogate for Trump, right? Okay. The New York Times reported Thursday that the Biden administration is considering allowing the Ukraine to use NATO-provided long-range precision, blah, blah, blah. Such a decision would put the world at a greater risk of nuclear conflagration than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? It's interesting. They go on to say that President Putin said that if they hit Russia, that means NATO countries are at war with Russia, right? He goes on to say some analysts believe Putin is bluffing, blah, blah, blah. But then he goes on to say these analysts are mistaking restraint for weakness. They're advocating a strategy of brinksmanship. Each escalation from HIMARS to cluster munitions to Abrams tanks to F-16s draws the world closer to the brink of Armageddon. Their logic seems to be that if you go to bear 5 times and it doesn't respond, it's safe to go to him even harder 6 times. Such a strategy might be reasonable if the bear had no teeth. The hawks in the Biden administration seem to have forgotten that Russia is a nuclear power. They've forgotten the wisdom of John F. Kennedy, who said in 1963, nuclear powers must avert those conditions which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war, right? We should take this advice seriously. So he goes on to say, talk about this, right? The nuclear thing, what you call it. Now listen to this. You think Hillary and the neocons are happy? RFK Jr. writes, imagine if Russia were providing another country with missiles, training, and targeting information to strike deep into American territory. The U.S. would never tolerate it. We shouldn't expect Russia to tolerate it either. This game of nuclear chicken has gone far enough. There is no remaining step between firing U.S. missiles deep into Russian territory and a nuclear exchange. We cannot get any closer to the brink than this. And for what? Now listen to this. You know the neocons aren't happy that the Trump people are writing this. He says, and for what? To weaken Russia, to control Ukraine's minerals. No vital American interest is at stake. To resist nuclear conflict for the sake of the new neoconservative fantasy of global full spectrum dominance is madness. The war fever in the U.S. foreign policy establishment is at such a pitch, it's hard to tell whether they believe their own rhetoric. In last Tuesday's debate, Vice President Kamala Harris conjured up images of Russian forces rolling across Europe. Surely she must know how absurd that is, right? So they're saying, now listen to this. RFK Jr. goes on to say, secondly, Russia made its war aims very clear at the outset, most notably Ukrainian neutrality and a halt to NATO's eastward expansion. Hundreds of thousands of lost lives and hundreds of billions of dollars later, no one is better off. Not Europe, not America, not Ukraine. It is past time to de-escalate this conflict. This is more important than any of the political issues our nation argues about. Nuclear war would mean the end of civilization, maybe even the end of the human species. Now listen to what he ends with. Former President Donald Trump has vowed to end this war, but by the time he takes office, it might be too late. We need to demand right now that Harris and President Biden reverse this insane war agenda and open direct negotiations with Moscow. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is an environmental lawyer and public health advocate. Donald Trump Jr. is executive president of the Trump Organization. Now, that, in case you hadn't known, now you'll notice something. Was that on the news? No, they didn't cover it whatsoever. So what I'm supposed to believe is that RFK Jr., notwithstanding that and I'll say this formally and officially, I disagree with his policies regarding Israel, certainly in Trump's and everybody else's in a ruling elite. But my point is not about that. It's about a genocide for all of us. And it's about a very honest, reasonable, one of the most reasonable articles that I've seen in a long time, and that's from Trump's surrogates. Why do I add this to it? Because it doesn't shock me, based on that article, in those kinds of positions, that the ruling elite might have made a decision that Donald Trump is in the way, shall we say. Let's look at let's talk about this friggin', fluffy-haired mook that tried to move on Trump. He's a real piece of work. Let's talk about how we can look at this particular thing, right? Number one. Let's start with Occam's razor. I always like to do this as a former investigator. Let's take different scenarios, no matter how improbable. Let's find some different scenarios and see what it could possibly be. Okay, let's start here. What if scenario A, this guy is just a loose cannon, a crazy nutcase, a fruitcake who was crazy over this Ukrainian thing, who listened to all the propaganda that he was given by the neocons, went to Ukraine, fell in love with the Azov Battalion, as he did, in fact, was involved in an advertisement for the Azov Battalion, came back, and he was so upset over the lies that he was, his mind was impregnated with, that he felt like, I got to stop Trump because Trump's going to come in here and stop the war. And God knows, we got to look out for Ukraine. We have to help Ukraine by allowing them to continue to get bashed to pieces by the Russian military. You lose me on that one, but I'm going to go with it. Okay. They've made up their mind that the only way to help Ukraine, is to make sure that generations of Ukrainian men get wiped out and that their infrastructure is flat, and that the people live in a third world hell where they don't have electricity or water or anything like that, and winter's coming. That's the way you want to help Ukraine. Remind me never to ask these bastards to give me a hand when I'm in a time of need, okay? But if in fact that was the case, and this guy comes back and he says, I know how to take care of this, why, I'll just do Trump in. Then what we have then, if that were the case, what we would have then is blowback. What we would have then is U.S. foreign policy of lying, U.S. foreign policy of propagandizing their people with lies and the world with lies, is blowing back to the United States, and violence is coming back home from Ukraine. And now we have a goofball crazy guy who's trying to kill a presidential candidate. Let's not forget that we had something, I don't remember if it was Rochester, Buffalo, somewhere up up in that frozen hellhole that is on the Canadian line. All jokes aside, it's really beautiful up there. I got a friend who's from Syracuse. I've been wonderful up that way. But my point being, there was some guy who went in like a supermarket a while back and shot a bunch of black people, and he was sporting the same that Black Sun Nazi symbol that the Azov Battalion wears. So one could argue that we've already experienced some blowback from the Nazi supporting in Ukraine, but this guy comes back and tries to kill a presidential candidate, which would have been tremendous political, cultural, and emotional disruption for this country. I mean, first of all, most people a lot of people who would have thought that the government was involved and that the Biden administration was involved and maybe inclined to, return fire, shall we say. So we could have had other killings. We could have all kinds of terrible things happen here, right? So this is blowback from neocon policy, if that were true. If that was true. Now, as I said, as a former investigator, I can't rule out the possibility. We never want to rule anything out until we know what it is. We don't know what it ain't. So we can't say for sure that it wasn't a kookball who just got back and said, Trump don't want to support Ukraine. For God's sake, RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. is writing op-eds. Actually, that just came out today, but you get the point. That's a possibility, which would mean blowback from neocon policy. Now, let's ask some questions that may lead one to question whether or not, in fact, that was the case, which I think we have to do. Here's a question that comes to mind. It's not just a question, but a scenario that makes you go, I don't understand how to answer for this. Donald Trump is currently running for president. You know, you turn on the news one day, Donald Trump's in Arkansas doing a rally. Donald Trump's in Sheboygan doing a rally, whatever the hell. Donald Trump's in Massachusetts. Donald Trump's in New Hampshire, right? Every other day, Donald Trump's somewhere doing a rally. Donald Trump is also has a home in, excuse me, I think it's Trump Towers, right? New York. So there's, you know, he could possibly be there. Donald Trump could be any number of places. Here's my point. Apparently, this putz showed up at the, according to what we're being told, not that we don't know that it's true or false, but let's run with this. Apparently, this putz shows up at the golf course at the whatever fifth hole or whatever, 11 hours before, and he sits out there and he waits for Trump, right? Here's my question. Trump could be in New York. Trump could be in any damn where, Nevada. He could be in the swing states. I would think he'd be in the swing states, right? Why? How would this guy know on a given friggin' day that Trump would be in Florida? Of all the 50 states, Trump could be in any of them. But you could actually look and see where he's going to give maybe you know, if it was at a Trump rally, you could at least say, well, there was an announcement that Trump was going to be at the rally, right? But it wasn't. Trump was on a day off playing golf. How does this guy know that Trump is playing golf at that location today? If he was there at 11 hours, so what? He's there 1 hour, 5 hours, 10 hours. How does he know on a given day? Trump has a schedule, but it ain't announced like that. And he doesn't just say, hey, I'm going to play golf. He doesn't put it on the internet because, let's face it, he knows Hillary Clinton and her ilk are out there. So he probably, you know, wants to hold his schedule kind of close to the collar, right? But for some reason, this guy had a clue, had an inkling, a hunch, one might say, that Donald Trump would be at a particular location within gunshot range on a particular day at a particular time. That's a really odd thing to inject into this conversation. How could he have found out? We don't know. That's a question we got to ask. Here's another one. You know, recently I got a couple of friends. One of them's named Dan Kovalik. Dan Kovalik recently had went to Venezuela to an anti-fascist, I'm sure that pissed off the Biden administration, but an anti-fascist convention, right? Yay, down with fascism, right? It sounds like a reasonable enough thing to me. Who's in favor of fascism? Well, I think we know the answer to that, right? Well, he comes back, he gets to the airport. Now, Dan is a professor. He's a human rights attorney. He's an all-around good guy, right? He's opposing, you know, genocide. He's been to Russia on numerous occasions. He's been to the Donbass. He's been to Syria. I had an opportunity to go to Syria with him a year or two ago, to be quite frank. I mean, no use me lying. I was chicken. I was scared. People were like, hey, we'll go to Syria. I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea. But what about Al-Qaeda? Well, they're not going to be in the area that we're in. I'm like, yeah, I don't think I'll go to Syria, right? So, okay, I'm checking. Sorry about that. You may thought greater of me, but I just felt like I was going to end up hugging an IED at some point. So I figured I'll just stay here with my friends and make a YouTube video. But Dan Kovalik went to Syria to see what's happening, traveled around, watched the election, right? Okay. So he's an all-around good guy fighting against genocide in Gaza, you name it, right? He's working on behalf of the Eastern Ukrainians in Donbass, trying to bring peace to them, and you name it. He gets back to the airport, they nab him. They take him away for 3 or 4 hours, question him, take his phone, you know, the usual stuff that they do. Danny Shaw, another guy I know. Danny's big thing is Haiti. I met Danny in Venezuela a couple years ago. In fact, that's where I first met him. Great guy, wonderful guy, fighting against the man, fighting against the neocons and the establishment and all that stuff. Danny's a really good guy, doing a lot of Gaza stuff and all the same kind of stuff that Dan Kovalik does, right? He goes to London to this Palestine or Palestinian film festival thing, right? He comes back, lands at O'Hare. Guess what? They grab him. They drag him into some back room. They hold him there for 4 hours. They tell him they're not going to let him leave until he gives them his passwords. They violate every, amendment in the Constitution. They violate this guy's rights. And he's an anti-war, pro-peace, anti-genocide guy. So apparently Dan Kovalik is on their radar. He's a peace-loving guy. Can't have that. Apparently Danny Shaw is on their radar. He's a peace-loving guy. Got to follow this guy around, don't you? Richard Medhurst, right? They got to grab guys like him. Sarah Wilkinson, all these darn peaceniks are being grabbed. MI6, CIA, you name it. They're following them. You know what they're doing. They're tapping their phones. They're listening to their conversations, probably following them all over creation, breaking in their houses, planting microphones. And the whole 9 yards. You know the game, right? Got them on all kind of watch lists. Here's my point. But this dude, old Schmucky the Clown, had a criminal record, a felony conviction, possession of weapons of mass destruction. I shit you not. So explain to me, somebody, logically, I say that rhetorically, how it is that Dan Kovalik, Danny Shaw, Sarah Wilkinson, Richard Medhurst, all of these people are on CIA MI6 radar being watched. They land in an airport. They're being grabbed. They're being searched. Their phones are being tapped. They're being everything in the world. But a guy who has a felony conviction for possession of weapons of mass destruction ain't on their radar. They have no idea. This guy can meander around the world. He shows up in Ukraine. He's in Romania. He's doing literally. He's interviewed by the New York Times. He's interviewed by Newsweek. He's interviewed by all of them. He's like some kind of an international hero, recruiting. Undoubtedly, come on, he's recruiting for Ukraine. So he's working with the all manner of intelligence and military intelligence agencies. But all of these other people, Medhurst, Shaw, Kovalik, Wilkinson, they're all on MI6 and CIA's radar, being watched like a hawk. Can't move. They're singing, Dan Kovalik's walking around singing Me and My Shadow, because every step he takes, there's 3 CIA agents behind him. Tulsi Gabbard, for God's sake, she's an active law enforcement person. Active military officer. Military officer. And every time she gets on a plane, they've got this dark skies or some such bullshit operation where every time she gets on a plane, they got like a bomb squad and a whole friggin' platoon of DHS officers following her around. An active duty military officer who was a member of Congress, who formerly ran for president, and she is on the radar of the CIA and everybody else, DHS, and they got a whole team. A bomb squad is assigned to follow around an active duty officer in the U.S. military, but they don't have a bomb squad or anybody else assigned to follow around this lunatic who was literally convicted of possession of weapons of mass destruction. Somebody tell me you're in charge of the CIA, the FBI, NSA, all of the above, and you got to assign your agents to follow somebody and keep that person on your radar. I'm going to give you 2 people. You choose one, because you only got a certain amount of officers and bomb squad guys and all that kind of stuff. You got a limited amount of resources, and they got to follow somebody, because hey, you'll be out of business if they don't, right? So here's your 2 suspects. Which one you going to choose? Suspect A, former member of Congress, ran for president, currently an active duty military officer who's in the public eye, a regular commenter on Fox News. Everybody knows who she is. That's option A. You got your bomb squad people who got to follow this person. That's suspect A. I'm going to give you suspect B. A lunatic with a felony conviction who was convicted of possession of weapons of mass destruction. You tell me, you're in charge of the intelligence community, which one of those suspects is going to be on your radar? I'm just saying, if you were convicted of possession of weapons of mass destruction, that's what we used to call in the legal community a clue that you could be dangerous. Now, not only do I ask myself this, he's a felon. How's he get his hands on a AK-47, a military assault rifle, and bullets? So I'm supposed to believe that this guy who was convicted of, let me find it. Wait a minute. You might not believe me. Ryan Ruth, convicted, WMD. It's going to be if I can find it, first of all, it's going to be hard. Let's see. Here we go. Ruth is let's see if we got it. Had bizarre social media posts. It's going to be hard to find it because they're going to hide everything about this guy. Let's see. Oh, listen to this. Ruth was convicted in 2002 of possessing a weapon of mass destruction, according to North Carolina. He barricaded himself inside a business with a gun in Greensboro. He was sentenced for driving without a license, carrying a concealed weapon, hit and run, convicted of possessing stolen goods. He was given probation. Imagine that. Isn't that interesting? Hey, what do you got there? Well, I got a weapon of mass destruction, and I think I'll barricade myself in a place in a house. And what do you think would happen to you? First of all, I can tell you what happened to you. They'd shoot you full of holes. So he was. So that's all we got on this guy. This is his record. The North Carolina has records for Ruth going back to 1997 for charges such as no operator's license, convicted in 2002 of possessing a weapon of mass destruction. Let me see if I see the news on that. Man with gun barricades himself inside a business, 2002. An armed man was arrested Monday morning after barricading himself in a business during a 3-hour standoff, police said. Ryan Ruth, 36, was arrested without incident at 1 a.m. Police said Ruth was pulled over about 10 p.m. Sunday during a traffic stop. But police said, he put his hand on a firearm and drove to United Roofing, where he remained barricaded inside. He was charged with carrying a concealed weapon, possession of a weapon of mass destruction, referring to a fully automatic machine gun. He was charged with resisting, delaying, and obstructing a law enforcement officer, driving while license revoked. So, I'm just saying, one might look at that and think to yourself, maybe, just maybe, that guy would be on the intelligence agency's watch list or something, rather than spend all their time chasing people who are opposed to genocide and active duty law enforcement officers who were former presidential candidates. Perhaps you could use your resources a little more judiciously. I'm just throwing that out there. So all I'm saying is this. You got a machine gun toting lunatic. And might I add, apparently he's a Ukrainian. Apparently he's running back and forth to Ukraine. He's recruiting He's apparently he's in the news. The news, you know, when you look at these interviews in the New York Times and interviews in in Newsweek or US News and World Reports, whatever it is, you understand that those are planted stories. You understand that those are all planted interviews. You got to understand that those interviews are somebody called the New York Times or somebody called US News and World Report or Newsweek or whatever the hell it was and said, interview this guy. And whoever called him was either with the Pentagon or with intelligence or some manner of both. It is very, very clear to me that at some point in his life, this guy had some connections to intelligence. And isn't it interesting how frequently that happens? How often it is that people who are involved in these kinds of situations seem to have those kinds of sordid backgrounds. The guy, what was his name? What's his name, Ray? The guy that shot Martin Luther King, right? Let me give you an example. The guy that shot Martin Luther King. We're supposed to believe that this guy broke out of a like Kentucky prison. So he was a jailbird. He was on the run, right? And somehow he got his hand on a gun to shoot Martin Luther King. And he had two passports, two fake passports. So here's a guy who shot Martin Luther King, and immediately he goes to Toronto. Where the hell did he get the money to go to Toronto? And where did he get these fake passports? He then goes to London. And how the hell did he go to London with what money? Who was paying for it? This guy, Martin Luther King, just got shot. And there's like an all points bulletin lookout for this guy. And he's going to Toronto. And then he's taking it. And then he goes to London. And then he's en route to either South Africa or Rhodesia, one of these countries that at the time was highly controlled by the British Empire, right? At least highly connected to the British Empire. So let's face it. It's very clear that the guy who killed Martin Luther King was an intelligence operative. If he is even the guy who killed Martin Luther King, there have been numerous investigations that have determined that where the shot was supposed to be fired from Martin Luther King, he would have had to contort himself like Gumby, or the people had to know the Gumby reference, but like a pretzel in order to get the shot off. It was nigh impossible. So the guy who killed Martin Luther King was a guy who had broke out of prison, who somehow then had the money and the wherewithal to travel to Toronto, to get somehow two fake passports, to travel to Britain with plans to travel on. He supposedly set that up himself. And where did he get the fake passports? In other words, he was an intelligence operation, and intelligence killed Martin Luther King. It's pretty clear. Let's face it, the FBI, when a couple years ago, there was a release of FBI files, and there was one FBI file, look it up, that was literal Mur King, M-U-R, for Murder King. They had a file that basically said Murder King. So come on. I think it's pretty clear what happened, right? These people who are involved in intelligence operations are often people who, for some strange reason, they don't have the financial wherewithal to travel around the world, but they do. And they stay wherever they want. I mean, think about this. If you wanted right now to travel to Ukraine, to Kiev, could you get there? There was a war going on. Do you think it was easy to get in and get out? And once you got there, how would you get to wherever you were going? You don't speak Ukrainian. How would you know where to go? How would you pay? How would you think, oh my God, I could get robbed? There's a lot of crime in Ukraine. But you're moving around. And once you got there, you're doing interviews and shit like that. And then he's like, well, I was in this city and things weren't working out, so I went to that city. How do you travel around when you don't speak the language? When you don't have a job? When you don't have any money? And how do you have Facebook pages and different things where you're saying we're recruiting people to go fighters? How do you do that? And you're not on the radar of the intelligence community. Doesn't seem to be very logical to me. Maybe to you, but not to me. So all I'm saying is this. It may very well be that this guy was just a loose cannon who went to Ukraine and was upset at old Trumpy because he felt like Trumpy was going to give up the ghost when it came to the Ukrainian conflict. But there are some very serious questions that have yet to be answered. And at this point, I think the American people can only really, come to one conclusion, and that is that there is a move afoot that is being financed and put together by people in very high places to ensure that Donald Trump never becomes president. I'm not saying that that's true or false, but I'm saying that based on the evidence, it's not unreasonable to suspect that thing. And here's the other thing, based on the context of history, let's face it, they rubbed out everybody. They rubbed out King, they rubbed out JFK, they rubbed out RFK, they rubbed out Malcolm X. Who knows how many anti-war people that we think died or killed themselves? Harvey Milk, who knows? Maybe they killed him. All of the people that supposedly we think, or we were told, killed themselves. Did they really? Well, there was a president, I forgot which president, you guys probably remember, who got sworn in and like within 48 hours died of pneumonia. You got to ask yourself, did he really die of pneumonia? And then he was replaced by like some right-wing system guy immediately. You have to ask yourself, did he really die of pneumonia? Or was the pneumonia a pillow being held over his head until he stopped struggling while three goons held his arms and legs? What about the infamous killing of Abraham Lincoln? Now, let me ask you this. Why is it that they rewrote history when it came to King, right? Well, Abraham Lincoln. When it comes to the death of Abraham Lincoln, what are we told? That some crazy actor just happened to crawl down from above and, a lone gunman killed Abraham Lincoln. But what we're not told is the truth. Did you know that there were 5 people hanged in connection to that? One of them was a woman, that it was a massive attack, that they tried to kill everybody in the Lincoln administration. One of the guys' name was Seward, I think. And he was in the bed recovering from I don't remember, from the injury or illness, whatever. He was pretty bad off, sick, and he was in a bed when the armed intruder came in with a knife to kill him, but he was a badass guy. He fought the guy. Apparently, he got the guy's knife from him and stabbed the guy himself. So he was a badass dude. He wasn't to be trifled with. But here's my point. American history was rewritten. So we're supposed to believe that a lone gunman shot Abraham Lincoln, but it wasn't. It was a vast conspiracy that was intended to decapitate the entire Lincoln administration and kill all of his cabinet, his closest associates in his cabinet. Why is it that they lie to us? And everybody's only taught about the lone gunman. Isn't that the story? A lone gunman? But it wasn't a lone gunman. Look it up. Let me show you something. Watch this. The plot against Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to say the conspiracy. And let me just look that up. Let me show you something. Watch this. Just saying, this is related. John Wilkes Booth didn't act alone. The conspiracy to kill Lincoln, right? And they get all about it. Bill Booth, okay. But Booth hadn't acted alone. Instead, the actor had been joined in the plot by a group of Confederate sympathizers whose intention was to somehow stave off the demise of the Keds, blah, 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 by killing the Union's leadership. There we go. Fellow plotters George Azerodt, David Harold, Mary Surratt, she was hung, and Lewis Powell were put on trial and executed. Several others were sentenced to prison for their roles in the event, right? Booth and his co-conspirators, so they go on. Though here's the thing, the four members of there are all of them. Lewis Powell, native of Alabama, right? David Harold, the son of a clerk at the Navy store in Washington, right? George Azerodt, a native of Germany, boatman, right? Other key figures, Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's leg, right? Okay. Was there an even bigger conspiracy? Many have found it hard to believe that Booth acted in concert with a few fellow sympathizers, blah, blah, blah. Some suspected that the plot had to be the work of full-fledged agents of the Confederate Secret Service Bureau operating, okay. So listen to this. Goldfield, who wrote an article on Lincoln conspiracy theory for Ford's Theater website, describes another darker conspiracy theory with anti-Semitic overtones. Listen to this. It revolved around the Rothschilds, a German banking family who had provided large loans to the Confederacy, and Juden Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State, who happened to be Jewish. Next to Davis and General Robert Lee, Benjamin was probably the most. So the bottom line is, isn't it interesting that even when you get to the Lincoln conspiracy, conspiracy, the name Rothschild pops up. How strange is that? And because the name Rothschild pops up, they say there's an anti-Semitic overtone. Why is there an anti-Semitic overtone? The Rothschilds have been involved in all manner of conspiratorial, chicanery for literal centuries. So if I say, yeah, you know what? It certainly appears as though some Rothschilds were involved in rubbing out Abraham Lincoln, then why is it anti-Semitic? I don't think so. Either they were or they weren't. But here's my point. The presidents, I should get Matt Ehret on sometime. He knows all about this stuff. Matt Ehret goes through all of the attempts to kill various presidents, and he says all of them, all the presidents that died in office were killed. I can tell you this, and that is my mentor was Paul Robeson Jr. Paul Robeson was very close to the Russians. He was very good friends with Sergei Lavrov. Paul Robeson told me, and don't forget, Paul Robeson Jr. grew up in this. I mean, he was educated. He went to school for a while in the Soviet Union. Paul Robeson Jr. told me that the Russian intelligence firmly believed that FDR was poisoned. That granted he had health problems, but I don't know if it's true or false, but I can tell you that Paul Robeson Jr. told me that he believed the Soviet intelligence believed that FDR had been poisoned. And it wouldn't shock me, because let's not forget, there was a plot to overthrow FDR right here in the US. Okay. So my point being this, there's a long and sordid history of acts being taken by very powerful people to overthrow the government of the United States using force. So it's not a stretch for someone to look at this act against Donald Trump and to think that the possibility that there was miscreant activity involved can't be overruled. And particularly when within 24 hours after the mishap, shall we say, Hillary Clinton's on national TV. She's on Fox News. She's being, I don't know where she's on Fox. Fox News reported it, but she's being interviewed saying, rats, darn, oh, fiddlesticks, for God's sake. That Hillary Clinton's out there saying, He's a threat to the world. Now, the Trump people, and I know they have to say this, and a lot of professional people in professional places have to say things like, well, it's the Democrats' fault because they're saying terrible things about Donald Trump. They're saying that he's a threat to the world. And therefore, lunatics like this guy and this other kid who was conspicuously in a BlackRock commercial, that lunatics like them, well, listen to the Democrats, and all these people say terrible things about Trump and how he's a threat to the world, and therefore they will be motivated to stop this threat to the world. Not that. That is not a reasonable argument. Not that it's not unreasonable to posit that as a theory, right? It's certainly not unreasonable. Unless you suspect that these were not lone wolf gunmen. Unless you suspect. Now, even if I put it like this, even if you do suspect it because these people are in the mainstream, maybe they can't come out and say what they suspect. But I'm just saying, amongst us, to me, it seems pretty clear that there's a history of powerful people taking out those who they don't want to either remain in power or come to power. That there are numerous questions about this incident and the last incident. I mean, literally, we were told that there were the last time, remember, we were told that there were no secret agents, no Secret Service agents or anybody on the roof because the slope of the roof was too dangerous. It was too steep of a slope for the Secret Service men to safely get on. However, for some reason, the shooter could crawl all over there like it was nothing. And in fact, we saw pictures the next day of like a 70-year-old man just wandering around on that roof, just wandering around, looking, taking pictures, what have you. Now, a 70-year-old dude could wander around on the roof, but DHS and Secret Service agents, it was just too dangerous for them. Oh, by the way, it wasn't too dangerous for the shooter. And a crowd of people could stand there, look at the roof and say, hey, look, there's a shooter on the roof. And all of them point up simultaneously. Simultaneously, there's a gigantic crowd of people pointing to the roof, saying, hey, there's a freaking guy on the roof with a gun. And all of the Secret Service agents in the area, DHF, cops, everybody whose job was to ensure the safety of the VIP, that's what you call them, who conspicuously left one roof unattended to. For some reason, they all decided not to look at that roof, even when everybody pointed to them. What did they have to do? 100 people are pointing at a roof saying, hey, there's a guy on the roof crawling around and he's got a gun. And they're like, huh? A what on the who? And he's got a what? Oh, pop, 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 pop. Oh, no. Who could have possibly saw that coming? And we're supposed to just accept that uncritically? And now, a couple months later, some guy happens to have, I guess, happened upon Donald Trump's schedule to figure out where Donald Trump was going to be on a given day. Of all the 50 states, at least let's narrow it down. Let's narrow it down to the 7 battleground states, plus Florida, plus New York, because he has a home in both of those. So let's say those are the states, right? Florida, New York, and the rest of the battleground states. Somehow, this guy not only picked the state that Trump was going to be in on a given day, he picked the location that Trump was going to play golf, and he got out on a golf course with a long rifle, waiting for Trump, and nobody noticed until the last minute. Nobody. They don't have cameras. The Secret Service didn't clear the golf course. So the Secret Service didn't walk the course before Trump even set foot on it. They didn't say, okay, former president's going to be on the course. Wouldn't you think they would walk the course? Wouldn't you think they would wander around the edges of the course and look at the woods? Don't you think they'd go to each hole and look at all the vantage points? One might think they do that, but they don't have time because they're too busy following Tulsi Gabbard around the airport. They're too busy stopping Dan Kovalik and Richard Medhurst, the real people that are a danger. They got all the time in the world. They got all the resources to chase after some poor anti-war schlep who's stopping back to coming home, who his worst transgression is that he is opposed to genocide. They got nothing but time and resources to follow these people around at the airport, to have them on their radar, to watch them like an eagle eye hawk 24 hours a day. But some guy who was literally convicted of possessing a weapon of mass destruction, who is clearly a loony bin, who happens to be on the golf course waiting to shoot Trump. For some reason, this guy totally escapes their sight. And we're supposed to be stupid enough to see it. Well, I ain't. That's that. Come on. All right. We're going to now look if there are any of my dear and
Coffee.